Vicksburg, Mississippi has plenty of haunted places, including houses, a garden district, and a military park where thousands of soldiers lost their lives. It's also home to what was, until recently, what some people considered one of the most haunted hospitals in the South. This is Khun State Memorial Hospital. Until recently, it sat at 1422 Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Vicksburg. It was 40,000 square feet on 12.8 acres of land and, interestingly, was in the shape of a cross. It also has a dark story that I think both history buffs and paranormal enthusiasts will enjoy. Let's explore the history of Khun State Memorial Hospital in one of the South's most historic cities. Vicksburg was founded in 1825 and soon began thriving, perhaps thanks to its close proximity to the Mississippi River. It was also the river that indirectly led to what the city is most known for, the Siege of Vicksburg. It was the middle of the Civil War, and Union troops were slowly taking the South, one city at a time. But because they weren't prepared for river combat, their attempts to take Vicksburg lasted for more than a year before the city finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, after a 47-day siege. Vicksburg residents famously would not celebrate Independence Day for a further 81 years. In the midst of all this, the hospital that would come to be known as Khun State was founded in 1832 after a smallpox outbreak. At the time, it was known as Vicksburg City Hospital and treated a variety of illnesses, both physical and mental. In addition to serving as a Civil War hospital and treating a yellow fever outbreak in 1878, the hospital served as a facility for the criminally insane who were housed in the same building as the mentally ill. Multiple asylum cliches, including lobotomies, strap-downs, and shock therapy, were all implemented. In 1901, a new wing was added to the building to house aging Confederate veterans. From 1910 to 1911, the hospital served as the site of the first Ole Miss Medical School. The building caught fire in 1918, though fortunately, as far as I can tell, there were no casualties. From here, some details become fuzzy. I read one source that said ownership of the hospital passed to the state in 1871. I read another that said the city of Vicksburg sold it to the state in 1956 for $5. Yet another source says the hospital was state-funded at one point, but always belonged to the city. Regardless, it became Vicksburg Charity Hospital in 1956, at which point another wing was added to the building. It continued to operate as Vicksburg Charity Hospital until it was closed and abandoned in 1989. In the late 1990s, several proposals were made as to what to do with the property. It was considered as a veterans home in 1994, as well as a possible psychiatric ward for adolescents or an assisted living facility. In 2000, the building was donated to a homeless shelter in Yazoo City, about an hour away. But it doesn't seem the homeless shelter did much with the building, because from its closing in 1989, it sat abandoned for a further 3 decades. And the abandonment and goings-on during its operation no doubt led to the rumors of paranormal activity. Over the years, multiple ghost hunting groups, news crews, and various citizens have entered the ruins of Khun State with the hopes of capturing something. At one point, a local film crew shot a movie there. I couldn't find the specific movie, but there were reports that they caught a disembodied voice on camera. Ghost hunters also heard a voice saying, "Want to come play with me?" An investigator who filmed a video in March 2016 claims they felt something brush up against their leg as soon as the cameras were off. People have also reported seeing full-bodied shadow figures and feeling a strange presence, as if someone was watching. It's also not uncommon to find writing among the dusty, long-abandoned machines. One investigator drew a tic-tac-toe board in the dust to see if a ghost would play back, though as far as I know, none ever did. Another crew found the word "help" written backwards in the dirt, and ghosts are presumably known for writing backwards. Was this a work of a prankster or a bored teenager, or was it a ghostly message?
Write this help on the table. Someone who is not one of us who is here living.
Do you want help?
In 2014, the hospital was featured on the TV show Ghost Asylum. The crew seemed to pick up a good amount of activity, especially in the newest building, which housed the mental ward, prison, and autopsy room. But perhaps the most disturbing thing paranormal enthusiasts have found at the hospital had nothing to do with ghosts. Around 7 p.m. on Sunday, June 28, 2015, a group of ghost hunters were exploring the hospital when they saw a trail of blood on a flight of stairs. The trail led them down the stairs and outside the building, where they found the body of 69-year-old Sharon Wilson. Wilson had been reported missing earlier that day when police in Leland, about an hour and a half away, pulled over 2 men who were found to be driving her stolen car. 33-year-old Raphael MacLeod and his 20-year-old nephew, Akeem MacLeod, were taken into custody, where the truth soon came out. The previous day, the 2 men broke into Wilson's home and ransacked it. Then they kidnapped her, drove her to the hospital in her own car, and at some point, raped and murdered her, the latter of which presumably happened inside the building of Khun State. Then they dragged her body down the stairs and left it outside, where they left it on the side of the road outside the building. I couldn't find exactly how she died, but her body had head trauma, so I'm assuming it was something along those lines. While in custody, Raphael claimed that they took Wilson to that particular area because they thought that if the people in the area heard gunshots, they wouldn't think anything of it. On March 2, 2016, Raphael MacLeod escaped from jail. He was on the run for 8 days and is thought to have spent at least part of that time hiding out at Khun State. On March 10th, he broke into a home and was subsequently shot and killed by one of the residents. After Sharon Wilson's body was found, David Childers, a co-founder of the Mississippi Paranormal Research Institute, said the building should be torn down because it was unsafe. It wouldn't be long before he got his wish. At the time, the community development director was also trying to get the building torn down. Previous attempts had failed because of asbestos in the building, but that was about to change. In September 2018, Vicksburg Mayor George Flaggs Jr. signed a contract with the company that would remove the asbestos and demolish the building. On Wednesday, February 4th, 2019, demolition on the hospital began. The hospital, with a rich legacy that stretched back over 180 years, is now gone. So what do you think of Khun State Memorial Hospital? Do you think it's really haunted? I would have loved to have visited at one point, but it seems like I just missed my chance, which is disappointing. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I've made several videos about various haunted places all over New Orleans, but today I wanted to switch gears a bit and talk about another one of the South's most famous haunted cities, Savannah, Georgia. Savannah is a beautiful city with a rich history that stretches all the way back to 1733. It's been named one of the top 10 most beautiful places in America by USA Weekend magazine and is the childhood home of Flannery O'Connor. But Savannah also has a darker history as one of the most haunted cities in the country. Savannah has certainly had its fair share of death and destruction. 10 separate yellow fever incidents killed tens of thousands of people, and numerous fires and murders only contributed to the city's dark past. So it's no wonder so many buildings in Savannah have a paranormal story behind them. Let's look at just 10 of the creepiest haunted places in Savannah, Georgia. Number 1, the Foley House Inn. Built by a wealthy widow named Honoria Foley back in 1896, the Foley House Inn boasts 19 beautiful guest rooms and has been named Best Inn in the South by Southern Living magazine. But underneath that beauty is a pretty crazy story. The inn was built over a house that had been destroyed by the Great Savannah Fire in 1889. But despite these dark beginnings, the first 100 or so years of the inn's operation went relatively smoothly. Mrs. Foley and later her son and grandchildren all lived at the inn, with nothing too bizarre happening. But all this turned on its head in 1987 when human remains were found in a wall of the building. To this day, the remains have never been identified, though many people believe the body belonged to a guest at the inn. There is a theory behind who this person is and what happened to them, but I'd say it's really more of a legend. As the story goes, the body belonged to a man in town who was romantically interested in Mrs. Foley and booked a room at the inn to get close and woo her. But when he got her alone and made his move, Mrs. Foley wasn't having it. He attacked her and she hit him over the head with a candlestick, killing him. Although this killing was clearly done in self-defense, Mrs. Foley was afraid she'd be implicated in the murder. So she convinced another boarder to help her hide the body, where it remained hidden for decades. At some point, the dead person was given the nickname Wally, because he was found in a wall, so Wally. Look, I didn't name the guy. Anyway, I'm not sure if the ghost story started before or after Wally's body was found, but people have reported seeing a man in a top hat in the inn's garden late at night. In another account, one guest said she saw a man enter the front of the building and disappear into the wall. She didn't find out until the next day that he had disappeared into the exact place in the wall that Wally's body was found years earlier. The story of who Wally really is probably just that, a story. But regardless of its authenticity or lack thereof, the Foley House Inn doesn't shy away from its paranormal past. It offers a haunted Savannah package that includes a haunted pub tour, placement in a supposedly haunted room, and a lunch at another one of Savannah's famous haunted locations, Moon River Brewing. Number 2, Factor's Walk. On a bluff close to the Savannah River sits an area known as Factor's Walk. The buildings that line it used to be cotton warehouses, though they've since been converted into various shops and office buildings, and connected by iron and concrete walkways. But one of the most interesting aspects of this area is the tunnels. These tunnels supposedly go all over Savannah, and one of the entrances is at Factor's Walk. They're thought to have been used to transport slaves who are led through the buildings and into the tunnels. On an even darker note, there are stories of people being bricked up in the walls. Between the Poe-esque stories and slave tunnels, it's easy to see why people experience paranormal activity in this area. The ghosts of slaves, disembodied moans, and shadow people have all been reported. These particular ghosts are also pretty touchy-feely, as quite a bit of physical contact has been reported, including people who felt cold hands touching them. A now closed store called Melanie's also had a woman in blue. Witnesses would hear disembodied footsteps and see a woman clad in blue who would promptly vanish. Small objects would also break seemingly on their own, though to be fair, that could have just been the work of a careless employee. Number 3, the Savannah Theater. Opened in 1818, the Savannah Theater was one of the many locations damaged by the fires that ravaged the city. As a result, it's been rebuilt multiple times, and paranormal activity has been reported there as far back as 1895. All the ghosts who haunt the theater are thought to have died there, and there are quite a few of them. Among them are a ghost actress who appears on stage, and a ghost director whose disembodied voice shouts from an empty seat in the audience. Both a little boy and little girl have been spotted as well as heard from the balcony. The little boy is said to be named Ben, and he loves harassing the spotlight operator. There's also a projectionist ghost who has been seen on the balcony and in the projection room. I assume left over from when the theater used to be an actual movie theater. According to one popular story concerning the theater, a group of female dancers was getting ready for a show. They were all in the middle of changing costumes when they felt like something was watching them, presumably all at once, which is interesting itself. So they freaked and ran out of the dressing room, even though they weren't done changing. I'm sure that was quite a sight for theater goers and staff. There's one more thing about the Savannah Theater that I find interesting. Several well-known actors have performed there, including Oscar Wilde and Lillian Russell. Also among these names is Edwin Booth, the brother of John Wilkes Booth, who of course assassinated President Abraham Lincoln back in 1865. I wonder if this dark connection makes the theater more susceptible to hauntings. Number 4, Colonial Park Cemetery. These days, if you have a problem with someone and want to confront them, you're probably just going to end up yelling at them on Facebook or something. It's pretty unlikely that you'd meet them at a dueling ground and pull a weapon on them, at least not without someone calling 911. But for a pretty large portion of American history, dueling was perfectly legal. One of these dueling grounds was just outside Colonial Park Cemetery in Savannah. Established in 1750, the 6-acre cemetery holds over 9,000 graves and was the city's main public cemetery before it was closed to burials in 1853. But the ghosts of people who died in duels probably aren't the only spirits here. Remember those yellow fever epidemics I talked about earlier? As it turns out, quite a few yellow fever victims are buried in Colonial Park. How many exactly? That's a good question. A plaque at the cemetery says that nearly 700 Savannah residents succumbed to yellow fever that year. But how many is nearly 700? Some people believe there were actually 666 victims, and whoever wrote the plaque rounded up to avoid references to the so-called devil's number. After the cemetery was closed to burials, Union soldiers occupied Savannah during the Civil War. These soldiers reportedly vandalized the graves, changing death dates and even digging up plots and moving the bodies. Many people believe that the boundaries of the cemetery have shifted and that people are now buried on the street outside the cemetery rather than in the actual grounds. If this did happen, it's not necessarily the fault of Union soldiers. The graves were probably just moved to make room for new ones. But if I were a ghost and someone vandalized and or moved my grave, I'd be pretty upset. Just putting it out there. Number 6. The Old Candler Hospital. Georgia's first hospital was originally named Savannah Poorhouse and Hospital and chartered in 1804 for sick seamen. Go ahead and make your jokes. I don't even care. The building was eventually acquired by the Georgia Hospital Board of the Methodist Episcopal Church South and renamed in honor of Bishop Warren Candler. It moved locations in 1980 and merged with St. Joseph's Hospital, where it remains today. As of 2016, the old building is for sale but sits abandoned. Just like Factor's Walk, this old hospital building has tunnel entrances. The rumor is that the tunnels were used to store the bodies of the many yellow fever victims that died at the hospital, and that said bodies were used for illegal autopsies. One witness claims they went to the tunnels with a group, and as soon as the group started to discuss these illegal autopsies, all of their flashlights shut off. But believe it or not, the other building's notable attraction might be even darker. On the property sits an old oak tree known as the Hanging Tree. Witnesses have reported seeing apparitions hanging from the tree at night. Of course, if you're anything like me, you might hear the phrase hanging tree and immediately think of Mockingjay. Admit it, you just started singing the song. It's okay, I did too. Number 6. The Sorrel Weed House. Arguably one of the more well-known places on this list, the Sorrel Weed House has been featured on shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, and BuzzFeed Unsolved. Considering that it's been called one of the most haunted houses in the country, that's probably not a shock. But before there was a house, the land was the setting for the Siege of Savannah in 1779. It was the middle of the Revolutionary War, and the British had just taken Savannah the previous December. So the American troops recruited the French to help retake it. The siege lasted from September 16th to October 18th, but the French and Americans failed to retake the city. The British remained in control of it until the end of the war. The siege ended with nearly 300 soldiers dead and over 600 wounded. So the land already had some pretty bad vibes going for it from the start. In the early 1840s, Francis Sorrel built the house for he and his wife Lucinda. Lucinda died a few years later, and Frances remarried to her younger sister, Matilda. But when Matilda found her husband in bed with a slave girl named Molly, she jumped to her death from the balcony. Molly also died a few weeks later, presumably by her own hand, or perhaps at the hands of Matilda's vengeful spirit. Needless to say, there's no short of reports of strange activity at the house. Guests have claimed to take orb photos and audio recordings of screams. One author captured a person on camera who they didn't believe was part of their tour group and thinks he may have been the ghost of a soldier. A lady in black has also been spotted on the premises, though it's not entirely clear just who she is. The house offers all sorts of tours, both paranormal and historical. Guests can participate in their own paranormal investigations 3 times a week, as well as an after-hours paranormal lockdown, which sounds just like a paranormal investigation that lasts all night. Personally, I think I'm getting a bit too old to stay up all night. But if you're unwilling or unable to make it to the house yourself, there are tons of investigations that have been filmed and posted all over the internet. So give them a watch for yourself and see if you believe the legends. Number 7. Wright Square. Named for James Wright, Georgia's last loyal governor, Wright Square was laid out in 1733, making it one of the city's oldest squares. In that time, it's amassed quite a few terrible stories, which in turn have led to ghostly legends. The first one doesn't seem to have any sort of real-life story attached to it, so I thought I'd go ahead and tell it first, and that is the story of the racist ghost. Witnesses have reported the ghost of a white woman who carries around a stick and swings it at any black person she comes across. You know, I've heard a lot of strange things since starting this channel, but I think racist ghost is a new one. Technically, there's only one person buried in the square. Tamachichi was chief of the Yamacraw tribe and an English ally. He had always wanted to be buried close to his English friends in Savannah, and when he died in 1737, that request was granted. His body was buried in the center of the square and marked by rocks. But 1882 brought the death of another prominent Savannah figure, Georgia Railroad founder William Washington Gordon. He's not actually buried in the square, but the rocks marking Tamachichi's grave were strewn about to make room for a memorial to Gordon. Some sources say Tamachichi's body was exhumed and his bones scattered about, but I'm not sure if this is actually true. A full monument to Tamachichi was eventually erected and now sits in the southeast corner of the square. As the legend goes, if you run around his grave 3 times while saying Tamachichi, his ghost may appear. But the square's most famous ghost is that of a woman named Alice Riley. Alice and a man named Richard White were Irish immigrants who came to Savannah in the early 1730s. Some sources say they were husband and wife, but most say they were lovers. Regardless, Alice and Richard became indentured servants to a man named William Wise. William was a cruel master, and Alice and Richard devised a plan to escape. It was Alice's job to bathe William, so one day while she was bathing him, she strangled him with a neckerchief and dunked his head under water until he died. The couple tried to run away, but was caught pretty quickly and almost immediately taken to the gallows. Richard was hanged almost right away, but Alice's life was spared for a few more months because she was pregnant. It's assumed the baby was Richard's, but some people believe the father was actually William Wise, which would make him even more cruel than we'd ever imagined. Alice gave birth to a baby boy named James sometime in late 1734. In January 1735, 6 weeks after giving birth, she was hanged. James died just 2 weeks after his mother, and they were buried together in a grave just outside Wright Square. But did the police have the wrong culprit all along? Alice always maintained her innocence, and there is speculation that she and Richard were framed because they were Irish Catholics who weren't looked on too well back then. There were also rumors that Alice was a witch who cursed the town before she died, but those were also rumors largely thought to be brought on by the anti-Irish, anti-Catholic sentiment of the day. Well, there is still quite a bit of anti-Catholic sentiment even today, but that's a different video. And whether Alice's spirit is angry because she was killed for a crime she didn't commit, or whether she's just sorry she got caught, she has a pretty good motive to stick around and mess with the living. Alice is said to roam the square, approaching pregnant women or women with babies and trying to take their babies away. Others say she cries out for her own son, but promptly disappears when anyone tries to help. Her story reminds me a lot of La Llorona, though she's clearly a much more sympathetic ghost. Number 8. The 1790 Inn. Contrary to what it may seem like, the 1790 restaurant and inn wasn't founded in 1790. It actually used to be 3 separate buildings, all of which were built in the 1800s. 1790 is a reference to the year Savannah had their first mayoral election and formed a city government. The first 2 ghosts that supposedly call this place home don't really have backstories. The first is a boy named Thaddeus, who's been spotted on the first floor, specifically in the restaurant. He likes to leave pennies lying around, and guests feel a warm presence, supposedly caused by him. I've never heard of a ghost that hands out money, but he's more than welcome to come to my house and leave coins lying around. The next ghost isn't quite as nice. This one was supposedly a voodoo priestess and likes to hang out in the kitchen, throwing pots and pans and spice jars at workers. She's said to target women quite a bit, though she herself is a woman. Ghosts are weird, but the inn's most famous ghost has so many stories attached to her, most sources can't even agree on her name. She was either named Anna or Anne. She was either in an arranged marriage with a sailor or was in an arranged marriage to someone else and fell in love with a sailor. She may or may not have been a barmaid at the hotel. In most versions, her story ends the same. Her sailor boyfriend leaves her, and in her distress, she jumps to her death from a third-floor window of the hotel. In some versions, she's killed by her husband. The husband she cheated on with the sailor, not the sailor she was in an arranged marriage with. I know, it's confusing. Anna has said to haunt room 204, the room where she supposedly fell to her death. Guests have reported small items like jewelry and wallets being moved and tugging on their sheets. Some even say they've seen a strange girl in the room, standing by the bed and crying. I've also read that Miley Cyrus stayed here while filming the last song in 2009 and tweeted out a picture of a handprint on her boots, supposedly from Anna. I could never find the original tweet, but the last song was filmed on nearby Tybee Island, so a story like this is certainly possible. Number 9. Calhoun Square. The supposed most haunted square in Old Savannah isn't just the home of churches, schools, and private residences. It's also a burial ground for slaves. Bones exhumed from the square in the early 2000s were later found to be the 200-year-old bones of slaves. It's thought that at least 1,000 slaves are buried underneath Calhoun Square, though nobody can really say for sure. Countless people have reported feeling a heavy weight on their chest or had shadows passing through them while walking through Calhoun Square. But most of the legends surrounding the square are centered on one house, 432 Abercorn Street. There are multiple stories about what might have happened here, and there's not really any evidence to back any of them up, but they're still told today, and it probably won't be too hard for you to figure out why. The first story concerns a former owner named Benjamin Wilson. Benjamin reportedly wasn't too happy about his daughters playing with kids at the nearby Massey School, where most of the students were lower class. So as punishment, he tied her to a chair and left her there for several days until she died. Another story tells of a family who left their 4 daughters at home, and 3 of them were dead when they came back. The story never specifies exactly how the daughters died. But in my opinion, the most interesting story associated with 432 Abercorn concerns another former resident named Wesley Espy. Wesley's father was Carl Espy, a judge who was secretly involved with bootleggers. Wesley fell in love with a girl who was dating a bootlegger who had ties to Carl Espy. I'm starting to realize how much this whole thing sounds like a bad soap opera. Carl found out about the relationship between Wesley and the bootlegger's girlfriend and begged him to stop seeing her, not wanting his son to have to bear the wrath of the bootleggers. But Wesley didn't listen. Soon after this conversation, Wesley was found dead outside the home. People thought he jumped from the balcony or perhaps fell in some sort of freak accident. Others are skeptical of this and believe it was murder, either at the hands of Carl or one of the bootleggers. To add evidence to this theory, Wesley had a very specific injury to his lower body that couldn't have been caused by a simple fall. I won't go into any more detail because I would like to not get demonetized, though the way this video is going, that might happen anyway. Wesley has been seen on the porch in the early mornings, supposedly coming back home after a late night out with his girlfriend. Or maybe he just wanted to watch the sunrise. People have also reported shadowy figures, strange noises, cameras failing in the area, crying, and giggling. The current owners don't actually live in the house, but in the carriage house behind it, so make of that what you will. Number 10, the Gribble House. The building at 401 West Perry Street is now a warehouse, but until 1941, it was a boarding house, and the site of what the press would later call the most diabolical crime in the history of Savannah. On December 8, 1909, Maggie Hunter moved into the boarding house, then owned by Eliza Gribble and her daughter, Carrie Olander. Maggie was newly separated from her husband, J.C. Hunter, and no doubt looking for a fresh start. But it didn't last long. The very next afternoon, a passerby found Maggie in the doorway of the house. She was barely alive, her skull having been crushed by an axe. Eliza Gribble and Carrie Olander were found inside. They had suffered the same fate, but had already succumbed to their wounds. Maggie died 3 days later, but right before she died, she implicated her estranged husband in the crime. But the police and the press took the case in a different direction. War newspapers of the day insisted the culprit was black, and police questioned over 150 black men. There was fear that the murders and subsequent suspicions of black men would prompt race riots, and at least one was reported. But finally, on February 10th, J.C. Hunter and 2 other men were indicted in the murders. J.C. was convicted and sentenced to death, but later pardoned by then-Governor Clifford Walker in 1923. It's largely believed that he killed his wife due to anger over her infidelity, and the other 2 women were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Even though the Gribble House is now a warehouse, it has no shortage of hauntings. The grounds apparently also used to be slave quarters, so that no doubt contributes. Local paranormal investigators have captured EVPs in the area, and one of them was even physically scratched. People have reported being touched and hearing voices that told them to get out. A lady in white appears in a wedding dress, as well as a shadow man. Well, I don't think the shadow man wears a wedding dress, but you know what I mean. At one point, people could tour the warehouse and even conduct their own paranormal investigations. I don't think you can do that anymore, but I'm pretty sure you can at least see the building and hear the story through the Ghosts and Gravestones trolley tour. Come to think of it, you can probably see a lot of these locations on that tour, as well as one of the many others that Savannah has to offer. So those are just 10 of Savannah's haunted locations. There are tons that I had to leave out, but I might delve into some of them deeper in a later video. So have you ever visited Savannah or experienced any paranormal activity there? Let me know in the comments. I was in Atlanta last year and thought about stopping by Savannah, but ultimately it was just too far out of the way to justify a detour. Now that I've learned some more about the hauntings there, I'm kind of starting to regret it. A few weeks ago, I did a video on 10 haunted places in New Orleans. During my research for that video, I came across a place called the Old Ursuline Convent Museum, which I realized later I'd seen on a ghost tour years ago and forgotten about. I'd also heard the story of the casket girls that supposedly lived there back in the 1700s. I was really interested in revisiting this legend, but wanted to save it for its own video. So, here is the story of the casket girls of New Orleans. Back in 1704, the United States as it is today was very different. I mean, it wasn't even called the United States yet, so that should tell you something. The few cities that existed, mostly along the coast, were very newly established, and most of the colonists at the time were men. Obviously, this was an issue because these men didn't come all the way from England just to die out within the first few generations. They needed wives. At first, the city recruited potential mates for these men within their actual boundaries, looking to jails and brothels for women. Needless to say, these women did not make good wives for the largely religious colonists, so they had to look elsewhere. Over the years, plenty more people than just the original colonists had been sent over to populate the New World. Many were convicts or prostitutes and made the journey against their will. But in 1704, the first of 3 groups of girls arrived in what is now Mobile, Alabama, with one purpose in mind: to be wives for the colonists. These girls were usually between the ages of 14 and 19, and mainly chosen because they were virgins. They had been recruited from France, usually from orphanages and convents. Another group was sent to Biloxi, Mississippi in 1719, and another to New Orleans in 1728. Unfortunately, conditions on the ships were harsh, and many girls didn't survive the trip. But those who did were allowed to mingle with men of their respective colonies and choose husbands from them. Unlike previous settlers, both the journey made by these girls as well as their choice in husbands was consensual. Upon their arrival in the city, the New Orleans group experienced immense culture shock, as did the already established colonists. Often called Pelican Girls because of the name of the ship they came in, these girls were noticeably pale. Many of them also coughed up blood and carried tiny bags with all their earthly belongings inside. And New Orleans residents couldn't help but notice that these bags looked an awful lot like tiny coffins. Because of these bags, the girls came to be known as filles à la cassette, or women with suitcases. So sorry if I mispronounced that. My French is, muy mal. Anyway, these girls were also called casket girls. By the way, when it's spelled like this, the word casket looks an awful lot like croquette, And if you've never had a croquette before, they are amazing. You should try one if you get the chance. Anyway, the word casket was also spelled casket, so these girls have most notably been known as casket girls. The year before the casket girls came to New Orleans, a group of nuns had arrived. These nuns established a school that housed the casket girls as they looked for husbands. When the nuns' Ursuline convent was opened in 1734, the girls were moved to the 3rd floor as they continued their search. The nuns would also often arrange marriages for the girls, maybe if they couldn't find husbands on their own. But New Orleans residents were leery of the casket girls. Unlike most houses in the city, the windows of the convent's 3rd floor were shuttered and nailed shut, and after the girls' arrivals, the death toll in the city doubled. Pale skin, coffin-shaped bags, high death tolls, tightly closed and nailed shutters in a city that rarely had them. To New Orleans, it was obvious that the casket girls must be vampires. Like I said in my Haunted Places video, New Orleans is known as a hub for all things paranormal. Countless ghost tours are available to tourists, and several people and websites have named it the most haunted city in the country. So it's no surprise that legends like this would spring up from locals' encounters with the girls who were, from their perspective, strange. But the reality for the casket girls wasn't so exciting. Many of the girls had trouble finding husbands, if they lived long enough, before succumbing to yellow fever or tuberculosis. The ones who did marry often didn't see their husbands for long periods of time, since many of them were fur trappers or traders, careers that required a lot of travel. According to legend, the King of France grew tired of so many of the girls failing to find husbands and having to resort to prostitution, so he ordered them to be brought back home. But once the nuns got up to the 3rd floor of the convent to get the girls, they were gone. They looked everywhere for them, but the windows had been sealed shut the whole time. This is when the vampire legends really kicked into high gear. Interestingly though, the legends say the girls are still on the 3rd floor of the convent, trapped inside with nails blessed by the Pope. So why couldn't they be found when the nuns came to take them away? Did they come back at some point? Were they trying to hide because they didn't want to go back to France? Or is this a contradiction in the story? I'll let you decide that for yourself. In 1978, 2 paranormal investigators allegedly visited the convent to see if the legends were true. They were kicked off the property for loitering, but returned anyway to stay the night and see what happened. As they slept, security cameras showed the windows opening and shutting several times before they stopped working altogether. The next morning, the bodies of the investigators were found on the property, ravaged and drained of blood. Another more recent story I found comes from a 2013 interview with a woman named Pam Keyes. In the interview, Keyes recalled a visit she made to New Orleans in 2001. Before going there, she knew about the legends of the casket girls and had heard that the 3rd floor shutters of the convent being open meant the vampires were out and about. That night, Keyes went for a walk by herself, and as she walked by the convent, noticed the shutters were closed. But on her way back to the hotel, she walked past the convent again, and the shutters were wide open. But the casket girl legends have more holes in them than season 8 of Game of Thrones. Seriously, what happened to Drogon? For starters, the shutters on the 3rd floor of the convent are hurricane shutters, and weren't installed until over 100 years after the casket girls arrived in the city. The nails couldn't have been blessed by the Pope either. No Pope visited New Orleans until Pope John Paul II in 1987. And the girls' paleness can be easily explained due to disease and being below deck on a ship for so long. Some of them contracted tuberculosis on the ship and may have still been infected upon their arrival in New Orleans, which would explain why they were coughing up blood. But the casket girl legends persist today as an interesting story, if nothing more. The old Ursuline convent is now a museum, and you can visit it and book a tour if you like. The legends have also found their way into pop culture. An early episode of the popular show The Originals is titled The Casket Girls and takes place during the Casket Girls Festival. I've never watched The Originals, so I'm not sure how much of the legends or true story they incorporated into the show or this particular episode. And as far as I can tell, the Casket Girls Festival isn't a real thing. The legends have also inspired a stage production called, fittingly, The Casket Girls. This modern rock dance theater production was inspired by the Casket Girl legends, and their website claims it brings their story to life. The show premiered in 2018 in Indianapolis, but a pretty good portion of it is available on YouTube if you want to check it out for yourself. I'll leave a link to the playlist in the description below. If you're into ballet or dance at all, I recommend you watch it because it's pretty interesting. So, what do you think of the Casket Girls of New Orleans? Do you think they're really vampires still trapped in the old Ursuline convent? Or do you think it's all fantasy, encouraged by the paranormal atmosphere that permeates the city? Let me know in the comments. Hey guys, just a quick note before we get started. This video is about places in New Orleans. And New Orleans obviously has a lot of French influence in it, so a lot of these names are French. And I don't know a lot of French, so I will probably have trouble pronouncing things. I did my best, but I might have screwed something up. If I did, I am very sorry. Know that it was not intentional. On to the video now. Maybe I'm biased because I live close by, but I think New Orleans is one of the most fascinating cities in the country. I've heard it described as a separate country all its own, and when you travel there, it does kind of feel like you're stepping into another world. New Orleans also has a reputation for being a hub for all things supernatural, and you can't go very far without finding a haunted location. Here are 10 creepy haunted locations in New Orleans. By the way, I won't be covering the Lalaurie Mansion because I've already talked about it in 2 different other videos, one of which actually involved me going into the mansion. I'll leave those linked down below if you're interested. Now, on to the video. Number 1, Café du Monde. I've heard New Orleans residents say Café du Monde is too gimmicky and that it's more of just a tourist trap than anything else. Nevertheless, it is world famous with New Orleans visitors. Opened back in 1862, the cafe is famous for its beignets. And if you've never had beignets, either there or anywhere else, you are truly missing out. Café du Monde is apparently a pretty popular spot for ghost hunting. It offers a clear view to the Mississippi River, where a lot of ghosts are apparently out just wandering in the open. The cafe also comes with its very own ghost waiter. Often nicknamed Walter or Blue, he's said to take your order and then promptly disappear. Considering how busy the cafe is almost every time I walk by, I think I would be more annoyed than scared at this. Number 2, Faulkner House Books. I'm a writer, so I love books, and consequently, I love bookstores. And what's the only thing better than a bookstore? A haunted bookstore. If you've been to high school in the United States, you've probably heard of William Faulkner. The Nobel Prize-winning author is famous for novels like The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, as well as short stories like Barn Burning and the extremely creepy A Rose for Emily. Faulkner was born and raised in Mississippi, but spent some time in New Orleans in the 1920s. The house he stayed in then was bought in 1990 by its current owners, who turned it into a bookstore. Faulkner House Books opened on September 25th of that year, Faulkner's birthday. The bookstore is a pretty popular tourist attraction with writers, and the most famous one to hang around is Faulkner himself. Faulkner's ghost reportedly never left the house he once lived in, and likes to make his presence known with tourists. Guests have reported smelling pipe smoke, even though the owners don't smoke, and I presume there is no smoking allowed in the building, as with most buildings these days. Ghost Faulkner is also known to give inappropriate caresses to women, as he was apparently known for doing in life as well. I'd love to visit the spot now that I know it's there, but I guess I better watch my back. Literally. Number 3, Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop Bar. I remember the early 2000s when the Pirates of the Caribbean movies were being released. Everyone my age wanted to be just like Captain Jack, and one of my friends even gave me a hairpiece similar to the one he wore in the movie. Pirates were cool again. But if you really like pirates, you should consider a visit to the former stomping grounds of one of the most famous ones, Jean Lafitte. Built in the early 1700s, this Bourbon Street haunt fronted as a blacksmith shop, but was actually thought to be used by Lafitte and his brother Pierre for their smuggling operation. The shop became a bar in the early 1900s and is now a piano bar. Its most famous ghost is Jean Lafitte himself. Lafitte makes his appearance as a full-bodied apparition dressed in sailor's gear. He never interacts with anyone and usually disappears as soon as he's spotted. Another ghost is an unknown woman who's been seen on the bar's 2nd floor. She's much more talkative with guests, sometimes holding conversations with them or even whispering in their ear, and is thought to have lived at the shop at one point or been killed there. Maybe both. On a slightly more disturbing note, a pair of disembodied glowing red eyes have also been reported. Number 4, the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum. Just under a 10-minute walk from the Fleet's Bar is the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum. Originally owned by Louis DeFillo Jr., the first licensed pharmacist in the country, the museum's mission is to further interest in the history of pharmacology and promote its further development for the benefit of the general public. But if a museum about pharmacy sounds boring to you, it actually holds all sorts of bizarre things, including a Civil War amputation saw, voodoo potions, and exhibits concerning questionable medical practices. The museum's most prominent ghost is that of Dr. Joseph Dupas, the second owner of the property. Dupas was said to perform gruesome experiments on pregnant slaves, as well as voodoo rites. He's said to wander the museum after closing, throwing books around, moving items on display, and triggering the alarm system. 2 ghost children have also been spotted playing in the area, thought to be DeFillo's children. Number 5, St. Louis Cathedral. If you've ever visited New Orleans, you've probably at least seen this cathedral. It's been open since 1727, has survived numerous fires as well as hurricanes, and is now one of the city's most famous landmarks. Like with many churches, there are people buried under the building, though this seems to contribute very little, if anything at all, to its ghostly legends. 2 women that were famous in life have also been spotted in death inside the cathedral. Madame Lalaurie, who I mentioned at the beginning of this video, has been spotted praying for her sins in a 3rd row pew. I'm not sure how witnesses know exactly what Madame Lalaurie is praying for, but if you know anything about her, you know she has quite a few sins she could probably stand to atone for. Voodoo Queen Marie Laveau has also been spotted praying in the pews or wandering the building. Witnesses have also heard singing and chanting coming from the area around the cathedral. This presumably happens when Mass isn't being held, otherwise it wouldn't be all that weird. The singing is said to be done by the ghost of a man named Père Dagobert. I really hope I'm pronouncing that one right. But the cathedral's most well-known ghost is a Spanish friar named Père Antoine, who served as pastor of the church until his death in 1829. I always thought Catholic churches had priests, not pastors, but almost every source I found about this said pastor, so what do I know? Even though there's no grave marker for Père Antoine underneath the church, some people believe he's buried there. His ghost has been spotted on altars and balconies around the building, and he seems to make more frequent appearances during the holiday season. He's also been seen in the early morning, wandering the nearby alley, which is also named for him. Number 6, St. Louis Cemetery, number 1. Some ghost hunters will tell you that ghosts don't actually want to hang out at cemeteries, that they'd rather spend eternity in the place that they died, rather than the place that they were buried. But given the historical significance of both this cemetery and the surrounding area, I guess some ghosts made an exception. St. Louis Cemetery, number 1, is the first of 3 cemeteries of the same name, all owned and operated by the Catholic Church. Number 1 was opened back in 1789 because nearby St. Peter's Cemetery was full. The cemetery is just a block wide, but holds over 700 tombs and 100,000 bodies. The cemetery is the final resting place for numerous well-known people. Among the famous residents is Homer Plessy, the plaintiff in the huge Supreme Court decision that made segregation widespread in the United States. Actor Nicolas Cage also bought an interesting-looking pyramid grave in 2010 with the intentions of being buried there one day. But Marie Laveau doesn't just spend her afterlife in church. She's also been spotted wandering the cemetery, as well as the area around the French Quarter. While standing near her grave, which is arguably one of the cemetery's most famous, people have reported being touched, hearing voices, or inexplicably starting to feel ill, though that one could just be from too much alcohol. Another well-known ghost is that of 19-year-old Henry Vignes. Henry was all set to be buried in a family plot at the cemetery when he died, but the owner of the boarding house he lived in sold the family plot while he was away at sea. Henry was never able to get the plot back and couldn't afford another one, so when he died just a few months later, he was buried in a pauper's grave in the cemetery. He's been spotted asking visitors where the Vignes family tomb is located, and at other funerals, asking if there's any more room in the grave for him. One other ghost I found was a man named Alphonse. Interestingly, I could never find a last name for this ghost, and it's not entirely clear just what happened to him. But anytime someone steps near the Peniad family tomb, he appears and warns them to stay away. So some people think he was killed by a member of the Peniad family. He's also known to take flowers from other graves and put them on his own. Jeez, buddy, get your own. But if you want to see any ghosts in the cemetery, it'll cost you. After numerous instances of vandalism, including someone painting Marie Laveau's tomb pink, the cemetery was closed to the public in 2015. It's currently only open to licensed tour groups and relatives of people buried there. Number 7, the mortuary. Now, I know what you're thinking. A haunted mortuary? So cliche. But hey, classics are classics for a reason. Located just outside the French Quarter, the mortuary was built as a private residence for the Slattery family in 1872. It continued to operate as such and passed between different owners until it became a funeral home in 1930. The business took care of all funeral operations and was aesthetically very nice, designed to mimic the comforts of home. An estimated 20,000 funerals were performed while the business was in operation. The property was sold to a new owner in 2004 who planned to turn it into a day spa academy, whatever that is. But they died mysteriously later that year and the property was put up for sale again. It survived Katrina and sat abandoned until 2007 when it officially became the mortuary haunted house attraction that it is today. But even before the property was filled with men and women in zombie suits, it amassed a fair number of actual ghosts. You know, if you believe in actual ghosts. Stories of a woman in white date back to the 1930s. The woman has been seen on the top floor of the building, sometimes crying, but occasionally asking visitors where her dead husband is. The 1970s brought stories of a mortician who accidentally died during a funeral when he slipped and fell onto the concrete. He's reportedly been seen in what used to be the morgue, continuing his work even in the afterlife. Maybe he just has a good work ethic? Like I said earlier, the mortuary still operates as a haunted house attraction, so it's difficult to find genuine paranormal activity. But guests to the haunted house attraction have claimed to feel they were being touched when nobody else was around. According to one paranormal investigator, ghosts are more active than usual right after the attraction closes for the night, due to them feeding off the energy of all the people who were just there. Number 8, the Andrew Jackson Hotel. If you hadn't guessed it by the name, President Andrew Jackson spent some time at this hotel, but not to sleep there. Back during the War of 1812, when Jackson was a general, he traveled to New Orleans to help prepare for the inevitable British invasion. Jackson soon declared martial law, which basically meant that the military was in charge. But even after the British were defeated, he refused to lift it. At one point, he had a judge arrested and banished from the city just for questioning him. When martial law was finally lifted, the judge returned to New Orleans and charged Jackson with contempt of court and ordered him to pay a $1,000 fine. All of this went down when the now hotel was a courthouse, which is why it's so closely associated with Jackson. But this famous French Quarter Hotel was opened in 1702 as a boys' orphanage and boarding school. In 1774, the building was destroyed in a fire and 5 of the boys were killed. The courthouse was built in that spot afterwards, but later demolished. The building that's there now was built in 1890, but apparently those 5 boys were reluctant to leave. Room 208 is supposedly haunted by the ghost of a boy named Armand. He didn't die in the fire, but instead fell to his death or was pushed out of a window. Armand has been known to wake up guests by laughing, pushing them out of the bed, or tugging on their sheets. Most of the ghost boys irritate guests with similar antics, but don't confine themselves to one room. Ghostly caretakers of the boys have also been seen cleaning rooms, and even Andrew Jackson himself has been spotted wandering the halls. One guest reported being woken up when a ghostly boy turned on his TV. When he turned the TV off and saw the boy vanished. Number 9, the Sultan's Palace. Ghost stories are often embellished or even made up entirely, which is something you should keep in mind when you watch videos like this. But the luxurious home known as the Sultan's Palace almost certainly never had a sultan living there. And in fact, very little about the entire story can actually be confirmed. Also known as the La Pretre Mansion, the home was built in 1836 and originally owned by Jean-Baptiste La Pretre, but was soon sold to a Turkish man who either claimed to be a sultan or was just assumed to be one because of his wealth and lavish lifestyle. The man soon moved his servants and his harem into the mansion, and nobody who entered was ever seen coming out again. He also threw lavish parties that lasted long into the night, so he was sort of the Hugh Hefner of his day. What happens next is fuzzy. One account says the house was unusually quiet the night after a big party, and police broke into the house because they were concerned. Another says a neighbor walked by the house one morning and saw blood going down the front steps and onto the sidewalk, and then contacted the police. Regardless, the police apparently opened the mansion doors to face a bloodbath. Everyone in the house had been brutally murdered and dismembered, making the floor slick with blood and internal organs. The Sultan's head was so badly severed he was almost decapitated, and his murderer had laid his body out on the couch, surrounded by 5 of the women in his harem. 37 deaths reportedly occurred during the massacre, and if you thought those deaths were awful, just wait until you hear the last one. During this alleged visit, police spotted a hand protruding out of the ground in the mansion's courtyard. It was the Sultan's brother, and he had been buried alive. Much like stories of the actual massacre, speculation on the culprit is kind of all over the place. The murders were supposedly never solved, but people say they were committed by the Sultan's brother or pirates. Others say the Sultan hired assassins to kill everyone in the house after his brother came to New Orleans and stole everything from him. But seeing as how both of the accused died in the massacre, I doubt either of them were actually behind it. Even if these stories are completely untrue, they unsurprisingly brought about a few ghost stories. The house is now an apartment building, and residents claim to hear disembodied screams throughout the rooms. Some have also claimed to hear music and smell incense, though that could just be the 15-year-old boy next door getting ready for a date. And of course, the ghost of the Sultan has been spotted on the property. It's said that he makes his appearance when women enter the building and greets them when they first arrive, hoping he can add them to his harem. I guess I better watch my back if I ever visit this place. Number 10. Jomani Bar. Gay rights have come a long way in the past few years, but in the 1970s it was a very different story. The bar known as Jomani Bar has operated as a sports bar since 1971, when it was known as a space for LGBT individuals, during a time when even liberal New Orleans didn't seem to accept them. On June 24, 1973, a fire was set in the building with 60 people inside. Some managed to escape, but security bars on the windows, a lack of markings to indicate emergency exits, and crowds all made it difficult. 32 people died in the fire. It was thought to be deliberately set and was considered the largest mass killing of LGBT people until the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016. The person who set the fire was never caught. After the fire, the reactions of New Orleans residents seemed to range from indifferent at best to hostile at worst. People were reluctant to talk about the fire, and most churches at the time refused to hold memorial services for the victims. In addition to bodies being burned beyond recognition, many were hard to identify because police suspected they were carrying fake IDs. I assume because they didn't want people to know that they were at a gay bar. Even after bodies were identified, some families never claimed the bodies of their loved ones out of embarrassment. As of November 2018, 2 of the bodies still remain unidentified. Needless to say, the hauntings of Jomani Bar are thought to be the ghosts of those who died in the fire. EVPs have been captured in the building, of ghosts supposedly saying that they feel forgotten and always want people to remember what happened there. Full-bodied apparitions have been spotted in the bar's kitchen, often accompanied by the smell of burnt hair. Shadows, white orbs, and screeching noises have also been reported. So these are just a few of the ghostly hangouts in one of the most haunted cities in the South. What are your favorite haunted places in New Orleans? Have you ever experienced paranormal activity there? Do you have a strange craving for beignets now like I do? Let me know in the comments. So a while back, I did a video on 10 haunted places in Savannah, Georgia. Problem is, there are tons of haunted places in Savannah, and most of them, including the ones I did in that video, could probably stand to have their own videos. But there was one place I purposefully didn't talk about in that video because I knew I wanted to do a full video on it. So, here you go. This is the history of Bonaventure Cemetery. Bonaventure Cemetery actually lies just outside Savannah at 330 Bonaventure Road in the town of Thunderbolt. Every source I found used Savannah and Thunderbolt interchangeably, so I'm assuming it's either a suburb or is just generally considered part of Savannah because it's so small that it is incorporated into it. Bonaventure was opened in 1846 as a private cemetery, and it was originally called Evergreen Cemetery. It was built on 70 acres of what was then the Bonaventure Plantation, which was owned by a man named John Mulrine. And it was established because other cemeteries in the area were quickly filling up. Interestingly, in the early days of the cemetery, many families liked to have picnics there as they visited the graves of their loved ones. The cemetery was bought by the city of Savannah in 1907, and I believe it was at this point that its name was changed to Bonaventure. Over the next century or so, it amassed a pretty rich history. Among those buried there are Johnny Mercer, a musician and co-founder of Capitol Records, and Conrad Aiken, a former poet laureate of the United States and Georgia. According to legend, Conrad Aiken had his grave fashioned as a bench so people would sit on it. I'm not sure why you would want anyone to sit on your grave, but to each their own. But interestingly, the cemetery's most famous resident is a 6-year-old girl named Gracie Watson. Gracie's father was a manager at the Pulaski House, which has been many things in its lifetime, but at the time was a hotel. Guests and staff at the hotel loved Gracie and were devastated when she died of pneumonia in 1889. An elaborate statue was carved over her grave, but we'll get to that more later on. There is one thing I want to address before I move on, though. Gracie died in 1889, but the building now known as the Pulaski House wasn't built until 1914. I'm not sure if there was just another building there at the time of her death that is now called the Pulaski House, or if there's something else I missed that could explain this. But I thought I would point it out. Today, the Pulaski House serves as a residence hall for students at the Savannah College of Art and Design, which I considered going to at one point, but never actually applied. In 1992, the Bonaventure Historical Society was founded. Their mission, according to their website, has always been the preservation and conservation of Savannah's historic Bonaventure Cemetery. However, just 2 years later, they would have their work cut out for them when a book thrust the cemetery and the entire city of Savannah into the national spotlight. Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, a Savannah story, was originally published in 1994. The cover depicts the now famous statue of the girl who is known as Bird Girl because she's supposedly holding out food for imaginary birds. Some people believe she was put on the cover because her 2 hands being held out represent good and evil. The book is nonfiction and most places list it as true crime. However, it mostly details author John Barrett's years visiting Savannah and eventually moving there after spending most of his adult life in New York. During his time in Savannah, he encounters people who can only be described as colorful. The actual crime part of the book doesn't start until about halfway through, when one of John Barrett's Savannah friends, a man named Jim Williams, was accused of killing his secret lover, a man named Donnie Hansford. Williams claimed the killing was done in self-defense, but was put on trial for murder. He was ultimately tried 4 separate times for Donnie's death. He was the first person in Savannah's history to be tried this many times for murder. But I will let you read the book for yourself to figure out how that all plays out. And as it turns out, the true part of true crime might not be entirely accurate here either. An author's note in the back of the book confirms that Barrett took certain storytelling liberties, and he also says, "Where the narrative strays from nonfiction, my intention has been to remain faithful to the characters and to the essential drift of events as they really happened." Midnight was a huge success, and like I said earlier, it thrust Savannah into the national spotlight. Tourism in the city was boosted by 50% after the book was published. Even though Bonaventure Cemetery was only mentioned a few times in the book, it too was thrust into the spotlight. A movie adaptation of the book was released in 1997, and parts of it were shot in Savannah and in Bonaventure Cemetery. But despite the attention their town was getting, many Savannah residents weren't too happy. They often referred to Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil as simply the book, and referred to the events in the story as true-ish. Terry Shaw, the then chairman of the Bonaventure Historical Society, I'm not sure if he still is, said of the book, "Dirty linens it is, and it brings, well, a certain low-class tourist to Bonaventure." I don't want to give too much away about the book or take personal digs at the author, but I can kind of understand where these people are coming from. Many of the portrayals of people in the book whether real or fictionalized, don't exactly paint Southerners in the best light. And a lot of the attention Bonaventure Cemetery got as a result of the publicity wasn't too good either. In one incident, someone backed up, I think, a truck into a sundial in the cemetery and then just took the sundial. After that incident, the famous Bird Girl statue was removed from the cemetery by its owner, Einar Trosdal, who said that this was done because we were just afraid something could have happened to it. Today, the statue is housed at the Telfair Academy in Savannah. But of course, if you want to read the book or watch the movie for yourself and make up your own mind, purchase links, as always, will be down below. And then, of course, there are the hauntings. Despite Bonaventure being not too well known before 1994, I'm pretty sure the legends and hauntings go back even further. Among the alleged goings-on are statues that move on their own, making facial expressions at visitors. This is particularly common among the angel statues, but one particularly well-known moving statue is that of a woman named Corrine Lawton, whose sculpture is carved over her grave. Her statue is said to be facing away from the rest of her family's burial plot because her family was ashamed that she took her own life. Corrine is said to smile at pleasant people, but scowl at people who scowl at her statue. To be fair, though, that statue looks pretty creepy. I can see why someone might scowl at it. Two more otherworldly creatures said to inhabit the cemetery are ones that most living people find adorable: babies and dogs. Visitors have reported a baby's crying near an actual infant's grave in the cemetery, though to be fair, this could just be an actual baby crying, and the fact that it's near a baby grave could just be a morbid coincidence. Others have claimed to feel breath on their heels or hear angry barking in the distance. This is said to be the hellhounds that inhabit the grounds, though again, to be fair, it could just be real dogs and or the wind. Another legend tells the story of a dinner party that took place on the grounds back when it was still Bonaventure Plantation. Dinner parties in that day were business as usual at the plantation, but this one took a dark turn. A servant approached the master of the house and told him that a fire had broken out. The master gathered up the rest of his servants and told them to move all of the tables, chairs, and food outside so his guests could continue enjoying the party. And they did. The guests continued to eat, drink, and party outside as the house burned down in front of them. At the end of the party, I presume when the house was completely burned down, the master raised a toast, and he and his guests threw their glasses against a tree trunk. The fire didn't seem to have any human casualties, but people say in the cemetery you can still hear a fire crackling and the sound of laughter. This story was recounted in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, but I can't find any other sources to confirm it actually happened. But the cemetery's most famous ghost is the aforementioned Gracie Watson. The ghost of Gracie herself is said to be seen playing in the cemetery from time to time, but most of these stories around her grave center on the statue. Visitors like to leave toys on the statue, and she is said to cry tears of blood if the toys are taken away. People also leave coins at the grave, and supposedly if you put a coin in her hand and run around her statue 3 times, the coin will disappear. Frankly though, I'm not sure why you want your coins to just vanish like that. What if you want a gumball later? Maybe these people are tourists who say Gracie took their money because they actually spent it on some gimmicky t-shirt at a gift shop and ended up regretting it and didn't want to admit it. At some point after Gracie's death, a fence was built around her grave. I couldn't find a reliable source to confirm exactly why the fence was put in place. Some people said it was because others rubbed the statue for good luck and it eventually wore down, so a fence was put around the grave to stop people from doing that. Others suggest that the fence was actually built to keep Gracie's spirit in. Although, to be fair, if she is still wandering the earth as a ghost, she seems like a pretty benign one. Of course, if you want to experience Bonaventure yourself, you can. It's open 365 days a year from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. There are several different companies that give tours of the now over 100 acres of ground that make up the cemetery. I'll leave links to some of them below if you want to check them out. And if you don't want to go all the way to Savannah, there's actually a tour app you can get. Unfortunately, the reviews are mixed at best, but if you want to spend the $5 and see for yourself, I will leave those links below as well. It's available both on iOS and Google Play. Believe it or not, you can also get married at the cemetery. Not exactly the place you'd expect, but kind of a strangely appealing idea. I kind of want to get married at Bonaventure now. I just have to find someone to, marry me. So that's just about all I have for you today on Bonaventure Cemetery. And of course, I would love to know your thoughts. Do you think Bonaventure Cemetery is really haunted? Have you ever been there, and have you ever had a paranormal experience? And do you think the publication of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil helped it or hurt it more? Let me know in the comments. Like I mentioned in my earlier video about Haunted Savannah, I would love to go there someday, but I actually passed up an opportunity last year. Hopefully one day I'll get another one. So, what is a mummy's favorite type of music? Rap. Please don't click away. So when I was about 8 years old, I got this book at a book fair. Return of the Mummy by R.L. Stine, book number 23 in his now infamous Goosebumps series. I've obviously had this copy for a while, and I don't know if you guys can tell on camera, but it's seen better days. But I did get it autographed last year when I met R.L. Stine at a writing conference, which I will always take any opportunity to talk about. Anyway, reading this book at age 8 kicked off a phase in me that a lot of kids go through, the fascination with mummies, specifically the ones of ancient Egypt. Even if you're not super into Egyptian mummies or never were, you've probably at least heard of the mummy's curse. But do mummies really return from the dead to exact revenge on those who disturb what's supposed to be their final resting place? Let's find out. Mummies have certainly had their time in the pop culture spotlight. Even though they go in and out of fashion just like any other trend, you're almost certainly familiar with the old mummy movies as well as some of the newer ones. Even though the latest attempt to bring vengeful mummies to the big screen was not that successful, mummies have clearly earned their spot in movie history. Everyone's familiar with the tropes. An archaeologist or a team of archaeologists discover the grand tomb of some long-lost prince or princess and are certain this discovery will put them on the map. But apparently the mummy himself or herself isn't too happy about this. So unhappy, in fact, that they return from the dead to exact their revenge on those who disturbed their tomb. But where did this curse originate? People have been fascinated with Egyptian mummies for at least 100 years, but the origins of this interest started out a little bit less respectful than what we're used to. Mummy unwrappings were pretty common in Victorian England. These live shows were exactly what they sounded like. Mummies would be brought out on stage and unwrapped for the audience. These unwrappings were held at places like theaters and universities and often sold out. You know, sometimes people give me grief for spending as much money as I do on concert tickets. But if I can pay my own money to see Niall Horan live, I think that's a little bit more ethical than paying to see someone's body being desecrated for entertainment. By the way, I didn't realize until after I wrote this script that I was talking about Niall Horan in a video about mummies from Egypt, where the Nile River is. Nile. Look, you guys stuck around for the first bad joke. You should expect this by now. Mummies also found their way into fiction during this time. In 1869, Little Women author Louisa May Alcott penned the short story called Lost in a Pyramid, or The Mummy's Curse. Dracula author Bram Stoker also tried his hand at mummy fiction with The Jewel of the Seven Stars, published in 1903. But as far as I could tell, nobody really believed in any sort of mummy's curse. Maybe some people saw these unwrappings as unethical and imagined mummies returning from the dead to exact revenge on those who desecrated their corpses. But these stories of the vengeful undead were largely confined to fiction. Nobody thought mummies were going to do this to real people. The real origins of this mummy's curse seem to have originated in 1922 with one of the biggest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. British archaeologist Howard Carter began his work in Egypt in 1891. Early in his career, he worked on an excavation of Amarna, a city built by a controversial pharaoh named Akhenaten. It might have been here that he first heard about Akhenaten's son and successor, King Tutankhamun. Just after World War I, Carter began searching for Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt's famous Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun, often referred to today as King Tut, was a relatively obscure king in his day, but his reign was marked by what came before it. Like I said earlier, Akhenaten, who was Tutankhamun's successor and probably his father, was pretty controversial. Unlike other Egyptians who worshipped many gods, Akhenaten only worshipped one, the sun god, Aten. Akhenaten built new temples for the worship of Aten and forbid worship of any other gods. Even Tut's birth name, Tutankhaten, means the living image of Aten. For many Egyptians who had always worshipped the gods that it was now illegal to worship, this change didn't go over so well. Akhenaten died in 1333 BC, at which point Tut took over the throne at the ripe old age of 9. With the help of an advisor named Ai, Tut worked to undo everything his father had done. He ordered repairs of the old gods' temples, reversed the decree that said Egyptians had to worship Aten, and moved the capital back to Thebes from Amarna. But other than restoring Egypt back to the way it had been, or at least trying, Tut didn't accomplish much in his short reign, which ended with his death in 1324 BC at the age of 19, roughly. Some historians think he was 18. It's hard to say for sure. The size of Tut's tomb would later suggest he probably died unexpectedly. Theories about what actually killed him range from a hippo attack to a chariot crash to straight-up murder. Another more likely explanation is that his death resulted from physical deformities that resulted due to him being the product of incest. Regardless of how Tut died, he left no heirs. His wife had given birth to 2 girls who are assumed to be twins, but unfortunately they were stillborn. Their remains would later be found in Tut's tomb. Tut was succeeded on the throne by his advisor Ai, who also later married his wife. I think that's where the murder theory came from. People thought that Ai killed Tut so he could marry Tut's wife, but that's just speculation. Later on, one of Tut's former generals, Horemheb, became pharaoh and had monuments to Tut destroyed and his name stricken from records. This was apparently pretty common in that day, and it might be at least one of the reasons why Tut was relatively unknown when Carter began his search. But it wouldn't remain that way for long. Earlier in 1922, Carter had been approached by Lord Carnarvon, who had been funding the expedition. Carnarvon actually didn't want to finance it anymore because it was going nowhere, but Carter begged him to reconsider, and Carnarvon agreed to stay on for one more season. Carter resumed digging on November 1st, 1922. Then, on November 26th, Carter and his team got the lucky break they were looking for. They had discovered the antechamber of the tomb, which was basically described as a hallway outside the actual, still sealed, burial chamber. Carter contacted Lord Carnarvon, who was at his home in London at the time, but agreed to travel to Egypt for the actual unsealing of the tomb. But the same day the antechamber was discovered, Carnarvon's pet canary was killed by a cobra. Most sources say the bird was actually eaten by the cobra, but one said that it was just attacked by the cobra and later died of fright. But whatever actually happened, this was seen by a lot of people as a bad omen. But the team didn't pay this any attention. They'd spent too much time and money to quit now. On February 16, 1923, Howard Carter, Lord Carnarvon, and the rest of the team entered Tut's burial chamber. As Carter went in, Lord Carnarvon asked, Can you see anything? Carter replied, yes, wonderful things. The tomb was filled with treasure, furniture, chariots, weapons, even some of Tut's walking sticks. Tut's body was housed inside 3 coffins and covered by the famous gold mask you've probably seen before. This mask is made from more than 22 pounds of gold and gemstones. This discovery was stunning, of course, not just because of the treasure, but because it was one of the only tombs of this sort to be discovered intact. Grave robbing was a problem that plagued ancient Egypt, and most of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings had been cleaned out long ago. Tut's tomb had been entered earlier, probably by these ancient grave robbers. They did take some things, but for whatever reason, didn't enter the actual burial chamber. It's been speculated that they didn't get this far because Tut was such an obscure pharaoh, and his tomb was so small and well hidden that they just assumed there wasn't much in there. But the joy of this discovery was short-lived. Not long afterward, Lord Carnarvon was bitten by a mosquito on his cheek, a bite that later became infected. He contracted blood poisoning and died on April 5th, 1923, just a couple of months after the burial chamber was opened. The night he died, all the lights in Cairo went out at the same time. About a month before Carnarvon's death, author Marie Corelli wrote to the New York Times about a quote she'd found in a book. The quote read, "Death comes on wings to he who enters the tomb of a pharaoh." Now that Tut's final resting place had been disturbed, Corelli was afraid of a curse being placed on those who were associated with the opening of the tomb. Lord Carnarvon, of course, died not too long after this. A few days after his death, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, famous for works like The Lost World and the Sherlock Holmes series, said he believed Carnarvon's death was the result of a curse. And there were plenty of suspicious deaths in the following months and years of people who had either been at the opening of the tomb or were somehow associated with it. On May 17, 1923, wealthy railroad tycoon George Gould died in his villa in France, supposedly from pneumonia. Gould had reportedly visited Tut's tomb and contracted pneumonia while in Egypt. Another death attributed to the curse was Prince Ali Kamal Fahmy Bey. This Egyptian prince was killed by his wife on July 10, 1923, just after visiting Tut's tomb himself. Lord Carnarvon's half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, also died later that year of blood poisoning after a routine dental operation went wrong. Howard Carter's personal secretary, Captain Richard Bethel, was found in his bed of an apparent smothering on November 15, 1929. Bethel had also given some of the artifacts from Tut's tomb to his father, Lord Westbury, who supposedly jumped to his death from the 7th floor of his apartment building on February 20th, 1930. Another member of Carter's team supposedly died of arsenic poisoning, and one of the radiologists who x-rayed Tut's mummy died mysteriously as well, but I couldn't find any other details on these deaths. It's difficult to say exactly how many people died as a result of the curse, since whether the curse even exists is up for debate. But I've seen estimates as low as 6 and as high as 20. Meanwhile, Howard Carter, the leader of the expedition, spent the years after the discovery of the tomb cataloging all of the artifacts. Some sources say it took him up to 10 years, others say it took him the rest of his life. He died in 1939 at the age of 66, 17 years after making the discovery of the century. Today, Tut's body lies in its original resting place in the Valley of the Kings in a climate-controlled coffin. His famous death mask is at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So now you know the story of the discovery of Tut's tomb and the unusual deaths that came after it. But was there really a curse? At one point, a scientific explanation was proposed for these deaths. Some mummies carried molds like Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus. These molds can supposedly cause congestion or bleeding in the lungs. Also found in some old tombs are bacteria like Pseudomonas and Staphylococcus, which can attack the lungs. These things sound dangerous, but nobody, scientist or tourist, has had any sort of illness or death that resulted from interactions with these fungi or bacteria. There is another interesting theory I found. In 2012, London's Curse, Murder, Black Magic, and Tutankhamun in the 1920s West End was released. The book's author, Mark Bainan, suggested that some of these deaths were actually the work of famous occultist Aleister Crowley. Crowley's own religious beliefs were inspired by the religion of ancient Egypt. According to this theory, Crowley would have seen the excavation of Tut's tomb as sacrilegious and wanted revenge. This sounds a bit far-fetched to me, but I thought it was interesting enough to share. And if you'd like to check the book out for yourself, links, as always, will be down below. But the most logical explanation for the curse is that there really isn't an explanation. When you take a harder look at these deaths, some of them start to make more sense in context, and the idea of a curse becomes a lot less likely. The first supposed victim of this curse was, of course, Lord Carnarvon, who financed the expedition. Carnarvon died of blood poisoning as a result of a mosquito bite on his cheek that became infected. This sounds strange on the surface, but Lord Carnarvon had actually been in pretty bad health for a while. In fact, he spent as much time in Egypt as he did in order to avoid the damp, cold climate of his native England. I couldn't find many details about his health, but apparently a lot of these issues stemmed from a car accident he'd had in Germany earlier in his life. As for the blackout at the time of his death, it was probably a coincidence. Blackouts in Egypt are still pretty common, even today. Every now and then you'll also hear of blackouts in major areas like New York City. There was one as recently as July 2019. Now let's briefly go back and look at the death of Lord Westbury, the son of Howard Carter's personal secretary, who supposedly jumped to his death after being given artifacts from Tut's tomb. Suicide is obviously a very serious subject, and it's very complex, caused by more than one factor. We don't know much about what was going on in Lord Westbury's life at the time of his death, but I do wonder if the death of his son a few months earlier was a contributing factor. Again, suicide is very complex, and I don't want to point to just one specific incident to explain everything. But it seems like this death might be more about personal tragedy than a curse. All in all, depending on what sources you look at, somewhere between 6 and 20 people died over the next few years as a result of this curse. This does seem like a pretty high number, but again, it is just an estimate. And again, we don't know what was going on in these people's lives at the time of their deaths. The last survivor who was present at the opening of Tut's tomb died in 1961. Dr. John Ora Kinnaman was an archaeologist on Carter's expedition and died of an illness at the age of 84. Hardly a premature death. But in my opinion, one of the strongest indicators that there wasn't a curse was the leader of the expedition himself. Not only was it Howard Carter's idea to disturb Tut's tomb in the first place, but he's also said to have basically hacked up Tut's mummy in the years afterwards for the sake of science. Just like Lord Carnarvon, Carter had been in poor health for pretty much all of his life. You think if anyone would be the victim of a curse-induced premature death, it would be him. Yet he lived another 17 years after the tomb was opened. So there are a few mysterious deaths that I couldn't find much information on. Could they be the result of a curse? Possibly. But the fact that the leader of Tut's tomb robbing himself, Howard Carter, didn't seem to be a victim is enough to make me skeptical. One of the sources I looked at for information in this video is a book called Raising the Dead. During the book's section on the mummy's curse, author Daniel Cohen gives another great reason as to why the curse probably isn't real. Even if Tut could exact revenge from the grave, he didn't really have any motivation to do so. One thing that was very important to an Egyptian was that his name be remembered. That, in some way, helped to assure immortality. Many funerary inscriptions read, "To speak the name of the dead is to make them live again, for it restores the breath of life to him who has vanished. Prayers inscribed on the outside of the tombs often exhorted the passerby to speak the name of the man buried within. Sometimes, where there was a political upheaval, the new ruler would try to obliterate the name of his hated predecessor by having the name cut out of all royal inscriptions. That was considered the ultimate punishment and revenge. It was a fate that King Tut suffered, and is one reason why so little was known about him. By finding King Tut's tomb, Carter and Carnarvon made sure that the name of this obscure and otherwise unknown king would be remembered and spoken of throughout the entire world some 4,000 years after his death. Far from placing a curse on them, he should have granted them 3 wishes. But none of this has stopped the story of the mummy's curse from blowing up. The story is so ingrained in pop culture, it was hard for me to find information about the actual curse. Most of the initial search results showed things like movies or games, including a 1944 movie called The Mummy's Curse, which I'm pretty sure I've seen before. I don't think I need to explain why the story of the curse is a lot more compelling than what actually probably happened. Looking at it from the mummy's perspective in these stories, you can see why they're upset. After all, if you were still sentient after your death and someone broke into what was basically your home and tried to steal your stuff, maybe even desecrate your corpse, you'd be pretty upset too. And of course, there is the fact that dead bodies, especially 3,000-year-old mummies, look pretty terrifying. This is what King Tut's mummy looked like when all was said and done. No disrespect intended to the boy king, but when I was a kid, that was the stuff nightmares were made of. If anyone's going to come back from the dead and try to kill me, it's going to be this guy. So as always, I am curious to know what you guys think. Do you think there's really a mummy's curse? Also, what's your favorite mummy movie? Being a child of the 90s, I really enjoyed the 1999 movie The Mummy, which of course was a remake of one of the classic Universal monster movies. I was about 10 or 11 when I first saw it, and I was terrified. Now, of course, I think it's hilarious. Ohio has tons of ghost stories and urban legends. Every time I look up haunted places, especially in the US, I have to stop myself from going down the rabbit hole that is haunted Ohio. Seriously, what are you people doing up there in Ohio? Anyway, I've talked about some haunted places in Ohio in the past, so let's go back there. Metaphorically, of course, it's kind of hard to travel right now. And talk about Gore Orphanage. The Gore Orphanage legend comes out of Vermilion, about 42 miles west of Cleveland in northern Ohio. As of 2018, the population of Vermilion was about 10,000, so it's a pretty small town. According to legend, Gore Orphanage was established in the 1800s and run by a man only known as Old Man Gore. Gore wasn't a very nice guy, and the orphans were often neglected. On November 22nd, 1910, the building caught fire. Old Man Gore managed to escape, but left the kids inside to fend for themselves. They tried to escape downstairs, but the staircase was already engulfed in flames. All of the kids died in the fire, and the fire reduced the orphanage down to its foundation. There are different theories as to how the fire started. Some believe that Old Man Gore started it himself, either as insurance fraud or because he was a sadist and or sick of the kids. Others blame a disgruntled male employee or an unknown crazy man. The latter lived in the woods near the orphanage and didn't like hearing the kids make noise. There's also been speculation that Native Americans started the fire for some reason, or that it was started accidentally when an orphan knocked over a lantern in the barn. Whatever happened, this is clearly where the hauntings began, or so the story goes. There is plenty of reported supernatural activity on the grounds where the orphanage is believed to have been. People have reported smelling smoke and hearing the roar of flames, as well as seeing the ghosts of the orphan children covered in flames and running into the nearby woods. Apparently, nobody ever taught these orphans how to stop, drop, and roll. A dark, shadowy shape has also been spotted on the grounds. It's believed to be the ghost of the person who started the fire, if the fire was indeed started intentionally. People have also claimed to hear footsteps on the remnants of the front porch and children singing nursery rhymes. Bright lights have been spotted in the nearby woods, and little bloody footprints have been spotted in the snow. You can apparently see and hear children on a nearby bridge at night. The children are dressed in period clothing, and they disappear as soon as you cross the bridge. Children crying has also been reported from the bridge. Other reports include the smell of burning flesh, as well as reported satanic activity in the area. In my research, I also found a picture of what appears to be a strange little girl peeking out from beneath a tree. At least that's what the writer of the blog entry says where I found it. I will let you decide for yourself what this actually is. There are a few more stories I want to share. The first says that if you park on the side of the road, turn your car off and flick your headlights on and off 3 times, you'll hear the screams of the dying children. These last 2 stories borrow pretty heavily from other popular urban legends. In the first, a couple heads to the orphanage ruins, parks their car, and goes for a walk. When they get back to their car, they hear what sounds like raindrops on the window. But as it turns out, it's not raindrops. It's drops of blood coming from a child hanging from a tree above their car. The last story is a little more general. It says if you park your car on the edge of the road, leave, and later return, you'll see tiny handprints on the car, almost as if the children have been surrounding it. If you've been on my channel for a while, or even if you haven't, this might sound familiar. It's very reminiscent of the haunted railroad tracks of San Antonio, which I have talked about before. I will leave that video up here in the cards and probably at the end of this video if you want to check it out. So here's the part where I spoil all the fun. There's no historical evidence that Gore Orphanage ever existed. There was no building called Gore Orphanage and no fire there. How could there be in a building that doesn't exist? There was no old man Gore, no burned up orphans. So where did the stories come from? As it turns out, there are several different true, or at least mostly true, stories that the legends could have derived from. The Collinwood Fire happened at Lakeview School in Collinwood, an area that is now part of Cleveland. I believe Lakeview was an elementary school, but I'm not sure. On March 4th, 1908, a janitor noticed smoke coming from the basement. He rang the fire alarm and managed to escape himself, but many of the children weren't so lucky. The school only had 2 exits, and the front exit was already blocked by flames by the time they got there. The children fought their way to the back exit, but it was locked. Firefighters tried to unlock and open the door, but it opened from the inside, and the children were crowding one another too much to get out. Of the roughly 370 people inside, 172 children, a teacher, and a rescue worker were all killed. It took less than an hour for the building to burn. Much like the fictional Gore Orphanage fire, the cause of the Collinwood fire was never determined. There were rumors that the janitor started it, and I believe he even spent some time in police custody, but no charges were ever filed. There was also speculation that it was caused by girls smoking in the basement. Whatever happened, this appears to be the first puzzle in the later legend. A real house built in the area was called Swift Mansion. It was also known as Rosedale. It was built in the 1840s by a wealthy farmer named Joseph Swift. I have read that Joseph Swift had 2 children who died while he was living in the mansion, but I couldn't confirm this 100%. Swift lived in the mansion until 1865, when he sold it to the Wilbur family. The Wilburs had a reputation for being strange. They were known spiritualists and often held seances in their house for the purpose of calling the spirits of small children back to earth. Nicholas Wilbur and his wife Eliza had 4 grandchildren who died from diphtheria during an epidemic of the disease in 1893. It's not clear if the grandchildren were living in the mansion at the time of their deaths, but what is clear is that, like most grandparents in this situation, the Wilburs didn't take this well. Their seances ramped up with the intention of communicating with their grandchildren. Mrs. Wilbur was said to pass food to her dead grandchildren at meals and even tuck them in at night. Nicholas Wilbur died in 1901. According to ghostofohio.org, the Wilburs sold the house in 1895 to the Sprungers, who provide the next piece in this puzzle. Joseph Sprunger started the Light and Hope Orphanage in 1903. It's not clear if the orphanage was actually on the property of Swift Mansion or if the orphans were kept elsewhere. The orphanage also doubled as a school, teaching orphans and destitute children skills like agricultural work. Most of what I read about the orphanage wasn't great. Sprunger was said to be a religious fanatic who believed in faith healing, telling sick children to pray rather than taking them to a doctor. The children were said to be fed calf lungs, hogsheads, and sick cows, and their food was often spoiled, if they were fed at all. Corn was supposedly boiled in the same water as dirty underwear. The building was infested with rats and bedbugs, and children were often rented out to local farmers as slave labor. But one source tells a different story. A 2014 article in the Morning Journal claims the children weren't mistreated at all and that the Sprungers were nice to them. No records of the place seem to have survived, so I'm not sure which version is true. There are a couple of reports of fires at the orphanage. The Morning Journal article says there was a fire on the property, but it was contained pretty quickly and there were no deaths. Another source talks about a fire at a girls' home that was part of the property, but again, there were no deaths. Joseph Sprunger died in 1911, and the Light and Hope Orphanage closed in 1916. These 3 historical events are thought to have been spread through word of mouth and eventually distorted into the Gore orphanage legend that we know today. Just one quick note though before we move on. There is a tombstone of someone named Sprunger in Indiana that sounds a lot like Joseph Sprunger, but his name is listed as Johann, not Joseph. So it is possible that Joseph wasn't his real name or that his name changed at some point for some reason. Hey everyone, Editing Mary here for just a little bit more context. One, I know his name is listed as John on his tombstone. Johann and John actually have the same meaning. They both mean God is gracious. John is of Hebrew origin and Johann is of German origin. 2, Johann Sprunger immigrated to the United States from Switzerland, so that might have something to do with it. I tried to dig into this a little bit further, but I couldn't find much. I'm not exactly an expert in linguistics, so if anyone else has any insight into this, feel free to leave it in the comments. So Gore Orphanage isn't a real place, but Gore Orphanage Road apparently is. It was built to separate Lorain County, where Vermilion is, from neighboring Huron County. It was originally named Gore Road because there was a surveying error during the building of the road, and a strip of land had to be annexed. In this context, the word gore refers to a material used to make clothes, and apparently that's what the annexed road looked like. It apparently later became Gore Orphanage Road when the Light and Hope Orphanage was in the area. Just a note about Gore Orphanage Road. I couldn't find it in Vermilion, at least not on Google Maps. The only Gore Orphanage Road I could find in the area was in Wakeman, about 14 miles south of Vermilion. I don't think this is too strange. It's possible that Gore Orphanage Road isn't its official name, or that Google Maps just got it wrong. I just wanted to point this out in case anyone else goes looking for it online. There are a couple of movies based on the Gore Orphanage legend, or at least inspired by it. The first one is called Gore Orphanage. It was made by a Pennsylvania couple on a shoestring budget and described as a psychological thriller. It follows a 9-year-old girl who is taken to Gore orphanage after the death of her entire family, where she has to fight to survive. If you want to check the movie out for yourself, I will leave a link below where you can stream it. There's also a novelization of the movie written by the movie's co-writer and director Emily Lapizardi, and I will leave a link to that below as well. There is another movie called The Legend of Gore Orphanage, but I couldn't find out much about it. From what little I did find, it looks like a supernatural horror movie that incorporates the legend into the story. According to its IMDb page, it was actually filmed in Vermilion. I couldn't actually find the movie anywhere. I did find a Facebook page for it, but there haven't been any updates since 2018, so I'm not sure if or when we will actually get to see this. According to the Northern Ohio Paranormal Society, the orphanage grounds are now a part of Lorain County Metro Parks. The area is open to the public, so you are free to go there and roam around, as long as you don't disturb anything. If you're from Ohio and have heard this legend before, I would love to know more about it in the comments. I'm always interested in hearing about these legends from a local's perspective. Of course, even if you are not from Ohio, I would still love to hear your thoughts. So, haunted asylums are pretty popular, and it's not hard to see why. These sites, especially the older ones, were often the site of a lot of death and general misery. So it's not hard to see why paranormal enthusiasts might think there are spirits there who couldn't move on from the trauma of their deaths. A while back, someone mentioned Georgia's Central State Hospital in my comments. I finally decided to look into it and thought I would share what I found with all of you guys. So, let's talk about it. So just to start out, there is a bit of contradictory information surrounding the hospital's history. This isn't too uncommon in a lot of the topics I research, especially things that happened decades or even centuries ago when some of the records might have been lost to time. There are also a lot of incidents and happenings where no specific date was given, only the decade. I'm not sure why this was done, but I will do my best to give you the information that I found. So I found 3 separate addresses for the hospital. One is 7 Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. Another is 2450 Vinson Highway. When you go to Google Maps, the only location they have listed for Central State is at 620 Broad Street, which was another address listed by a few sources. I'm not sure exactly why there are so many different addresses listed. I have a couple theories. Either 1, the campus was so big that different buildings often had different addresses. 2, some of the buildings often relocated, or 3, a bit of both. The hospital opened in 1842 as Georgia Lunatic Asylum. Until 1866, they admitted white patients only. By 1870, 1/6 of the patients were Black, and unsurprisingly, patients were segregated by race. In 1897, the hospital was renamed Georgia State Sanitarium. In 1870, the hospital superintendent, Dr. Everts, reported bad conditions to Georgia's Governor Rufus Bullock. He claimed the buildings weren't properly heated, lit, or ventilated, that there were a lot of leaks, rotten floors, roaches in the kitchen, and that people were sleeping on straw beds. All these problems were blamed on insufficient funding, and the hospital started to receive more money, but conditions didn't exactly improve. By 1904, the hospital had an average of just under 3,000 patients a day. Many were admitted for reasons that might sound odd today. Things like disappointed affection, religious excitement, domestic unhappiness, and ill health and jealousy. I'm not sure if these were euphemisms or maybe outdated medical terms, or if they sounded weird even a century ago. There were rumors that people got sent to Central State for things like smoking pot and being in interracial relationships. Parents in the area would threaten misbehaving children by telling them they would send them to Milledgeville if they didn't straighten up. Milledgeville is the city where the hospital was located. I probably should have said that from the start. In the early 1900s, the hospital asked for more government funding to build a tuberculosis wing since a lot of patients were dying from the disease. There was also contaminated water that was causing typhoid, so they asked for a new water supply. By 1940, the hospital had been renamed Milledgeville State Hospital and held about 10,000 patients. Just 20 years later, it had swelled to its peak at 12,000, and the patient-doctor ratio was 100-1. By the 1960s, 1/4 of the doctors on staff struggled with alcoholism or drug abuse, and none of them were psychiatrists. In 1952, Peter G. Cranford, the hospital's chief clinical psychologist, published his book, For the Grace of God. The book details the history and goings-on of Central State up to that point. It's been out of print for a while, but around 2009, it was packaged together with another book in a mini collection called Damnation Hospital. Amazon calls both books together the two most exhaustive looks at Central State's early history. I will leave some links below if you want to check it out. In the meantime, Central State wasn't exactly employing the most ethical practices. Lobotomies, straitjackets, shock therapy, and ice baths were all used. Children were put in metal cages, and adults were forced to take steam baths and cold showers, which I'm sure were far different than the sauna-like conditions those words bring to mind. Surgeries were often performed without a doctor even being present, let alone operating. Homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths due to patient neglect or abuse also happened. Another issue the staff had to deal with in the mid-1900s was forced sterilization. Georgia enacted a law in 1937 that made this practice legal, and many doctors and politicians of the day supported it. It didn't end until 1963, by which point over 3,000 people in Georgia had been forcibly sterilized. 3/4 of them were psychiatric patients. I don't know for sure if this practice was carried out at Central State, but there is a pretty good chance it was. In the 1960s, Georgia's Governor Carl Sanders started moving patients to homes that would suit them better. He was aided by Jimmy Carter, who at the time was a Georgia state senator, and of course went on to become the 39th U.S. president from 1977 to 1981. In 1967, the hospital was renamed Central State Hospital. In my research, I also came across a lawsuit from 1978. A Central State employee was injured on the job in 1971 and filed for workers' comp. Then in 1977, standing at work all day caused her feet to swell, which was a consequence of her earlier injury. Workers' comp and lawsuits are things a lot of companies have to deal with, and I don't think this necessarily means anything on its own. But with everything else going on at this point at Central State, it doesn't look too good for them. Central State was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. By this point, a lot of the buildings were falling into disrepair, and some of them had to be destroyed because they were deemed unsafe. The patient abuse continued into the 1990s and even the 2000s. A 2007 report said 42 Central State patients had died under mysterious circumstances over the previous 5 years. Journalists continued to expose patient abuse, and government officials slowly agreed to change things. So sources vary on when Central State closed. One source said it closed in 2010, but another said it was set to close in 2013. The hospital is actually still in operation, though it houses less than 200 patients as of 2015, and only one, maybe 2 or 3 buildings are still in operation. Central State today is described as a forensics facility, as well as a residential living center for people with behavioral health disorders. Its address is also listed at 2450 Vincent Highway, which is one of the addresses listed earlier. The building that used to be the hospital's train station was turned into a museum at one point, but I don't think it's still open. In fact, most of the hospital campus's 200 buildings on 2,000 acres of land now lay abandoned and falling apart. Visiting them is technically considered trespassing, so I would advise you not to go there. Besides, there are plenty of videos of people visiting the old campus that allow you to experience the ruins from the comfort of your own home. In 2019, a project was launched to turn the old Central State campus and surrounding area into Renaissance Park. Their mission is, according to their website, to develop long-term strategies for repurposing the former Central State Hospital campus by identifying potential business opportunities and coordinating the development of the property with a focus on job creation, education, and real estate value for the community. There's not much more information about specific buildings or projects, but I'll leave a link to their website if you would like to keep up with things. So, given Central State's dark history, it's not a surprise that there are rumors of paranormal activity on the grounds. Reports include apparitions, disembodied voices in the area, screams coming from abandoned buildings, phantom touches, breathing on the back of people's necks, and even rumors of demonic rituals. 2 women who visited the grounds claimed that someone or something was throwing things at them from inside on the upper floors while they were outside. A member of another group claimed to feel a sudden chill, which is something pretty common with ghosts. Yet another member of that group reported the smell of rotting flesh, which, according to them, is a sign of demonic activity. I've never heard this before, but it might be true, or at least a common belief. There's also a cemetery nearby that holds the remains of 25,000 people, many of them in unmarked graves. Nearby Cedar Lane Cemetery holds 2,000 bodies, I believe, in addition to this. I haven't found information about hauntings associated with these particular areas, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So one last thing before we go, and this isn't related to Central State specifically, but I thought it was worth bringing up. While I was writing the script for this video, I coincidentally started reading a book called Asylum by Amy Cross. I can't really show you a copy because I'm reading it on my Kindle, but I'll put a picture up here to show you what the cover looks like. It is fiction, but takes place in a mental hospital that may or may not be haunted, which is obviously similar to Central State. I just started this book about a week ago. I'm around 70% done with it, and it's not bad. And as a writer myself, I like to take any opportunity I can to shout out other authors. So if hearing about Central State has left you with an appetite to hear more stories about haunted mental hospitals, I will leave a link to that book below. So that's all I have for you today on Central State Hospital. In a lot of ways, this story is pretty typical of other haunted mental hospitals, but I had no idea things went on as long as they did. There was still patient abuse happening in my lifetime, and the lifetime of a lot of my viewers, I'm sure. If you're from the Milledgeville area and have more insight on Central State, I would love to hear it in the comments. Sometimes locals have a perspective on things that the internet and books just don't. And of course, even if you're not from the area, I would still love to know what you think. I've made at least one video already about the hauntings in my home state of Mississippi. Living both in this state and also relatively close to New Orleans, I'm in a part of the world that is basically a gold mine for alleged paranormal activity, so I figure why not talk about it. Today I'm going to tell you about Mississippi's most haunted house in one of America's most haunted cities. Let's talk about McRaven House. McRaven House, or McRaven Mansion, sits at 1445 Harrison Street in Vicksburg. It's the oldest structure in Warren County. In fact, it was built before Vicksburg was actually a town, or even before Mississippi was a state. At the time the building now known as McRaven went up, Vicksburg was known as Walnut Hills, and Harrison Street was known as McRaven Street, hence the name. McRaven House was originally built in 1797, but it wasn't the sprawling mansion it is today. It started out as a small, 2-story, 2-room hideout for a highway bandit named Andrew Glass. Glass traveled up and down the Natchez Trace on horseback, holding people up at gunpoint and robbing them. Glass's original house was a pretty simple structure, as he probably didn't need much else as long as what he had did its job, which was keeping him hidden. Everyone seems to agree that Andrew Glass died in the house, but it's not really clear how he died. There is a legend that he was shot during a robbery and knew he was going to die, but managed to escape and get back home, where he asked his wife to shoot him again and put him out of his misery. Another version of this story said Andrew was a womanizer, and his wife slit his throat out of anger and jealousy. Whatever happened, his death paved the way for more people to live and die in the house. After Glass's death and his wife's presumed evacuation of the house, ownership went to Newitt Vick, who Vicksburg was named after. Then, in 1836, Warren County Sheriff Stephen Howard and his wife Mary Elizabeth bought the house. The couple was expecting their first child and wanted to expand the house to accommodate their growing family. They built the second part of the house, adding a bedroom, a covered porch, and a staircase. When Andrew Glass had originally built the house, the second floor was only accessible by a ladder. The Howards no doubt improved on the house and made it more suitable for a family. Unfortunately, they wouldn't stay long enough to utilize these renovations. Just 2 weeks after giving birth, Mary Elizabeth died of complications at the age of 15. There was a lot of contradictory information on the baby's gender. Some sources say she had a girl, and just as many say she had a boy. But regardless of the baby's gender, Stephen Howard left McRaven just a couple of years after his wife's death. He died shortly thereafter as well, and the baby was raised by his parents. I couldn't figure out what happened to the house for the rest of the 1830s or even most of the 1840s, but in 1849, it was bought by a man named John Bobb. John Bobb built the third and final portion of the house. He made it more elegant and added a men's changing room and a Greek Revival facade, the latter of which was later replaced with pillars. This was the house's last major renovation. Other than Stephen Howard's renovations, which closed in some areas of the home, most of these renovations were just add-ons, and not much else about the house was really changed. Because of this, National Geographic once dubbed the house the time capsule of the South. The picture here shows the renovations the house underwent over the years and how it grew. The portion on the left was built by Andrew Glass, the one in the middle by the Howards, and the last one on the right by the Bobbs. In 1861, the Civil War began. This obviously had a huge impact on the country, especially Vicksburg. One source did say McRaven served as a Confederate camp at one point, but most of what I found about the house in the Civil War concerns the siege of Vicksburg in 1863. During the siege, John Bobb and his wife Selena authorized the house to be used as a hospital for both Union and Confederate soldiers. They built a cave under the house and stayed there during the siege, but the soldiers didn't have this protection. Many of them died from common war maladies like botched surgeries, and the house acquired a lot of damage during the siege, much of it from cannonballs. 11 unidentified bodies are buried on the property, and in most cases, if not all, the entire body could never be found, only pieces of it. A leg here, an arm there. But as dark as this story is so far, the house wasn't quite done with death. About a year after the siege, John Bobb saw Union soldiers destroying the prized rose bushes in his yard. He threw a brick at one of them and knocked him down, and the soldiers swore revenge for this. Later that night, the soldiers came back with more friends, dragged John Bobb out of bed, shot him multiple times, and killed him. After this, his wife sold the house and moved to Louisiana. After John Bobb's death and his wife's leaving, the house stayed vacant for a few years until it was bought by the Murray family in 1866. Patriarch William Murray, his wife, and some of their children died in the house. But two of their daughters, Ella and Annie, never married and lived in the house together well into the 1900s. The Murray sisters rarely left their house and lived with no modern conveniences of the time except a telephone. They were also known to be hoarders, ordering so many things from catalogs that the things they bought filled up the entire house except the dining room. Ella died in 1960, and after her death, Annie sold the house and went to a nursing home, where she died shortly thereafter. The house was then bought by the Bradleys, who turned it into a tour home in 1961. In 1979, the house was added to the National Register of Historic Places. It was listed on their website as the Bob House, and the website says their address is 1503 Harrison, not 1445. I'm not sure why the address is different. The house switched hands again in 1985, this time bought by a man named Leyland French, who converted it back into a residence. But the ghosts of McRaven, if they do exist, weren't too fond of French. He was physically hurt several times while living there, including one incident where an unseen force pushed him to the floor. Another time, a drawer slammed shut on his fingers and broke his thumb. After this, French contacted a priest and had the house blessed. This seemed to help a bit, and he stayed in the house until 2007, when he put it up for sale and left to take care of his parents. He still owned the house, of course, and had caretakers for the upkeep of the property, but he didn't live there. Then in 2015, the house was sold to the Reed family. French had put the house on the market for $1.75 million, though I doubt that's how much it actually sold for. Despite the caretakers, the house was falling into disrepair, and the Reeds wanted to save it. They also turned it back into a tour house/museum. As far as I know, they still own it, and it still operates as a museum today. So with all that death and dark history, it's no surprise that there is a ton of paranormal activity here. I've researched a lot of haunted places, and McRaven has more documentation of paranormal activity than almost any other place I've looked into. I definitely can't get into all of it here, but I will try to hit all the major points. By far, the most active ghost is Mary Elizabeth Howard. Her old bedroom still has a lot of her things in it, including the bed she died in. Brian Riley, a tour guide at the house, says he once saw a teenage girl in the 1836 bedroom who disappeared shortly after she realized that he had seen her. He also claimed to see a dresser in that room open and close by itself. Since Mary Elizabeth died in the house in 1836 at the age of 15, I think it's safe to pin these things on her. Mary Elizabeth is said to be a friendly ghost, but also loves to pull pranks. She's known to lead guests astray, mess with alarm systems and lights, touch people, and even photobomb guests. At one point, her antics got so crazy that the police got involved. But Mary Elizabeth also has an understandable softer side. She's especially active around mothers and young children. The house's first owner, Andrew Glass, has also been spotted in the original room he built and lived in, at least one of them. Even people who didn't see him still claim to feel his presence. Women say they're touched by an unseen force, and men suffer irrational bouts of anger. Brian Riley claims to have seen a chair in Glass's room tilt back and then slam forward. Glass's ghost has also been blamed for things going missing in the house, though these things always turn back up eventually. And of course, the ghost of the house's last major renovator, John Bob, has also been spotted. Brian Riley claims to have seen Bob's ghost at least twice, once in the middle of a tour. People have also spotted Bob strolling on the porch, smoking a cigar. They've even heard him talk. He's also been spotted in the men's changing room, where the smell of cigar smoke has also been reported. William Murray has also been spotted in the house, and phantom piano playing has been attributed to the ghosts of his daughters, Annie and Ella. In addition to former owners, Civil War soldiers are a common sight. One was reportedly spotted as early as 1864, when a reporter saw a traitorous Confederate soldier that's been spotted multiple times since. Guests on guided tours have reported seeing the ghost of a Confederate soldier, spotting his reflection in a mirror. Another group said to haunt the property is Native Americans. In the 1830s, the federal government forced tens of thousands of Native Americans in the southeastern United States to make an over 5,000-mile journey on foot to a territory designated for them in modern-day Oklahoma. This journey has come to be known as the Trail of Tears. Part of this trail winds through Mississippi, maybe even the McRaven property itself. Since many Native Americans died on this journey, it's no surprise they've been spotted here as well. Other reported activity includes orbs. In one incident, Janice Rayleigh, the president of the Ghost Preservation League, was taking pictures in the cemetery. She and a colleague started playing songs from the period, including the popular Dixie. When they looked at the pictures, the ones that had been taken while Dixie was playing had tons of orbs. These orbs are also reported on important dates like the anniversaries of battles or when there are reenactments taking place. Other activity includes objects downstairs moving on their own, as well as phantom taps in the men's changing room. Two ghost boys named Eric and Peekaboo are also said to play with toys around the house. A bunch of people have documented their experience at Raven House and put it online. The blog on McRaven's official site has several of these, and there's also a 2017 paranormal investigation by Society of the Supernatural, as well as an episode of Ghost Adventures that features the house. I will link all of these below. Today, the house still functions as a tour house and museum, offering history tours, haunted tours, and a combination tour. You can also host your own paranormal investigation, which is where I'm sure a lot of this footage online comes from. When I was a kid in the 90s, I used to get chain letters all the time. They were usually something simple. This is a letter, forward it on to a certain number of people, then add yourself to the list of people who have already gotten the letter. These chain letters have been around for well over a century, but not all of them are so innocent. Let's look at a story that was spread via one of these chain letters, the story of Carmen Winstead. There are a few different versions of the Carmen Winstead story floating around. Some are pretty bare bones, others are more detailed, so I've cobbled together everything I could find to give what I feel is the most complete version. Carmen's story begins around the year 2000 when she was about 17. We're not sure where she lived at the time, but her dad lost his job, and I guess he got a new one in Indiana because that's where the family moved. Carmen was a shy girl and had trouble making friends, especially since she'd transferred to a new school in the middle of the year. She soon found a group of girlfriends, but eventually discovered they were trashing her behind her back, as girls often do. When she confronted the girls, they started bullying her. Things like calling her nasty names, writing swear words on her books, and vandalizing her locker. One day, Carmen finally had enough. She decided to stay after school to tell her teacher what was going on, but she never got the chance. After lunch, the teacher announced there would be a fire drill. When the alarm rang, the students filed outside and teachers began calling roll to make sure everyone had gotten out. As the roll was being called, Carmen's bullies decided this would be the perfect time to embarrass her. She was standing near a sewer, so they pushed her in. Her classmates standing nearby saw what was going on and started laughing, but stopped when they saw her body at the bottom of the sewer, unmoving. The police were called, and they discovered that Carmen's face had been torn off by the ladder, and her neck had broken when she hit the bottom of the sewer, killing her. The girls who pushed Carmen told the police that it was an accident, that she had fallen, and everyone believed them, for a while. Over the next few months, Carmen's classmates began receiving strange messages on their various social media pages. The messages recounted what really happened to Carmen, called for the receiver to share her story, and sometimes urged the bullies who pushed her to come forward, or else. Some versions of the story said the bullies who pushed her were killed one by one and their bodies were found in sewers, but didn't give much more information. One incident that has been described in more detail is what happened to David Gregory. David Gregory was a classmate of Carmen's, according to most sources. Some said he was just some kid who heard about her. Either way, he got the message about Carmen but laughed and deleted it. Later on that evening, when he went to take a shower, he heard laughter coming from the shower, and it sounded like Carmen's. How he would have known that, I have no idea, but I'm just the messenger here. David ran to his phone or his computer, depending on the version, to repost the message, but it was too late. In the middle of the night, David's mom was woken up by a strange noise. When she went to his room to check on him, he was gone, and a message written in blood said, "You will never have him back." David's body was found the next morning in a sewer with his neck broken and the skin on his face peeled off. Other sources have told a similar story, but say it happened to a girl. So if you haven't figured it out by now, the story of Carmen Winstead isn't true. There are no records of anyone named Carmen Winstead dying in this manner in Indiana or anywhere else. The story started circulating back in the early 2000s on sites like MySpace. Various versions of it have been posted on places like Facebook, Reddit, Amino, and some creepypasta websites. I read in a few places that the story was started by teenage girls on MySpace to see how many friends they could get from it, but I could never find confirmation of this. The most common form the Carmen Winstead story is told in is chain letter. The poster, sometimes claiming to be Carmen herself, will tell the story of what happened and warn you to pass it on. If you don't believe the story, or if you don't read the whole message and pass it on to more people, sometimes within a specific time frame, Carmen will get you. When you go to sleep, you'll wake up in a sewer, unable to move. You'll hear Carmen's laughter and she'll rip your face off, the same thing that was done to her. Carmen's also been said to be able to see without eyes, maybe because they were ripped off along with the rest of her face in the sewer. She won't kill anyone younger than 13 and can be weakened by loud, obnoxious noises. She's also reportedly been spotted in a Grand Theft Auto game. Interestingly, some versions of the story will end by saying that the story is true and you can Google it. But when you do Google it, all you find is page after page reiterating the legend. No news articles or other reports pop up. In some versions, Carmen's name has been changed to Jessica Smith, and in at least one, David Gregory is changed to Ron Anderson. Jessica can also get you from a toilet or shower. The Carmen Winstead legend isn't exactly mainstream. Most of the information I found on it was from various paranormal websites. It's never been talked about by any sort of paranormal investigators or even folklore professors or historians like a lot of these legends. It's mostly confined to social media. And it's easy to see the appeal of this story. It's about an outcast who has a hard time of things but gets her comeuppance in the end. Indiana, where the story takes place, can be seen as a relatively normal place to live, giving the story a sort of everyman vibe. There's also an element of fear for those of us who read the story but have no other attachment to it. If we raise awareness about bullying by sharing Carmen's story, we can feel good about ourselves and avoid her wrath. And it wasn't until I started filming and saying Carmen's name out loud multiple times, but the name sounds an awful lot like karma. Interesting. But perhaps the biggest part of the story's appeal is its chain letter format. According to an article from Miami University, chain letters are letters that direct the recipient to send out multiple copies so that circulation increases. By the way, Miami University is actually in Ohio, not Miami. This has nothing to do with anything, but I just thought it was interesting. Chain letters stretch all the way back to the 1880s, when places like schools and orphanages would use them in an attempt to get funding. These money-centric letters got really popular in the Great Depression for obvious reasons, though using them for money-making purposes today is legally dubious at best. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, chain letters began migrating from the regular post into email format. A few articles over the past couple of months have suggested chain letters are making a comeback because of the pandemic, with emails asking cooped-up people to do things like share a recipe or an inspirational quote. Frankly, I don't think chain letters ever went anywhere. They've always been around, with their most recent iteration being in the form of social media posts. Instagram follow loops will require someone to follow all the people on a list, then add their name to the top of the list and share the post again, presumably in an attempt for everyone involved to get more followers. And of course, we've all seen those social media posts. They start by sharing some sad story about a boy dying of cancer or something similar, then at the end they'll say, "Share if you have a heart." Or maybe they even promise that a certain amount of money will be donated to a related charity every time the post is shared. Chain letters give people a sense of community and purpose, or annoyance and a unnecessary obligation, as CNN once put it. So that's all I have for you today on Carmen Winstead. I first heard this story around 2012 and figured out pretty quickly that it wasn't true. Still, when you read something alone in your room at night with all the lights off, you'd be surprised at how terrifying it can be. India is a country that, admittedly, I don't know a whole lot about, but a look online in the general realm of interest in the paranormal suggests that there are a lot of haunted places there. This isn't exactly a shock. India is pretty big and has a pretty long history, so paranormal activity, or at least talk of it, is to be expected. Let's look at a reportedly haunted mansion in one of India's top tourist destinations. This is Charleville Mansion. Charleville Mansion is in the mountains of Shimla, the capital of the Himachal Pradesh, which I really hope I'm pronouncing correctly. A Pradesh is basically a province or territory. I think the word is used throughout Southeast Asia. In 2011, the population of Shimla was just under 170,000, so it's not quite as small as some of the other towns we've talked about in these videos. Most sources I read said Shimla was beautiful, with snow-topped mountains, lush green fields, clear water, and flowered valleys. One source even said it was a retreat destination for Gandhi, but I couldn't confirm this. So if you don't know, India was under British imperial rule from 1858 to 1947. The first story associated with Charleville Mansion doesn't have a specific time period it takes place in, but it does involve an army officer, and all of these stories involve the British in some way. So this army officer arrived at the mansion at some unspecified time, and before long, he started to hear rumors that the house was haunted by a poltergeist. From the little I knew about poltergeists before researching for this video, they seem to attach themselves to people rather than places like most ghosts. I don't think that was the case here, since this ghost seemingly stays in the mansion the whole time and never leaves. But poltergeists are known for other things. One of their major characteristics is an unusual level of violence, or at least chaos and noise. They've been known to throw things, slam doors, physically attack their victims, and even start fires. Some experts think poltergeists might not actually be a result of paranormal activity, but rather people acting out and blaming their bad behavior on it. Anyway, this officer didn't believe in ghosts, but wanted to test the theory that ghosts existed. So he closed and locked all the doors in the house. Don't ask me where he got this idea from, but it seemed to work. After closing the door to a room upstairs, he heard a crash. He ran upstairs and found the room in total disarray, with mirrors broken and furniture thrown against the walls. The officer left the house immediately and never returned. But the most well-known, or at least most well-spread story associated with the mansion is that of the Baileys. Victor Bailey was a British man who was appointed Assistant Secretary of India's Railway Board in 1913. After arriving in Shimla for his new job, Victor and his wife began house hunting. Like many characters in these stories, Victor and his wife decided to stay at Charleville Mansion because the rent was cheap. But after asking why the rent was so low, they were told about the previous haunting. The Baileys decided to stay at the mansion anyway, partially due to the rent and partially to its location. They didn't experience anything paranormal while they were there. But one night, when they'd been there for about a year, they were out for the evening at a dinner party. The only person at the house was one of their servants. At some point during the night, he thought he saw someone in the house. Some sources said he actually saw Victor Bailey himself, but other sources only described the man as an English gentleman. Whoever the man was, the servant tried to talk to him, but he could only watch as the man disappeared through a closed door upstairs, the door to the same room the poltergeist had trashed years earlier. The Baileys left the house after this incident. It's been said that the house was known for being haunted after this, but I'm a little bit skeptical. You'd think it would have gained that reputation after the poltergeist story. After this, the mansion's history becomes unclear. One source said an English woman lived there until the 1940s, then sold it to an Indian family after India gained its independence in 1947. Most sources said the house is now owned by an Indian man or an Indian family who has or have completely refurbished it. But one other thing I found interesting was from a man named Vargas Khan on his website, vargaskhan.com. In a blog entry on Charleville Mansion, Khan claimed that nobody can seem to find the mansion or know where it really is. He also claimed the photo of Charleville that has been floating around on so many sources and that you've probably seen in this video is fake. He also said the current owner has renamed the mansion. If this is true, that would make it difficult to find. I have no idea if any of this is true, but reading about it did remind me of Himiro Mansion, which I talked about in another video. If you missed that video and want to check it out, I'll leave a link to it in the cards up here and at the end of this video. Long story short, Himiro Mansion is a mansion in the mountains of Tokyo that very few people know the true location of. There's a whole supposed legend behind it, but as it turns out, this legend actually seems to have evolved from a video game called Fatal Frame. There doesn't seem to be any origin story for Charleville Mansion, which makes it even more mysterious. But if its current owner really did change the name after buying it, maybe he wants his family and the mansion to have some privacy. In multiple sources I looked into, it was said that Rudyard Kipling talked about this mansion in his short story, My Own True Ghost Story. You're probably familiar with at least Kipling's name, even if you only know him from the cartoon adaptation of his famous work, The Jungle Book. According to Britannica, Kipling's family belonged to the highest Anglo-Indian society. I'm not 100% sure exactly what this means, but I'm assuming Kipling's family was British. Kipling was born in Mumbai, but taken back to England at age 6 and put in a foster home. He spent time in the US, but returned to India in 1882, when he would have been about 17. He returned to England in 1889 and went back and forth between there and the US until his death in 1936. My Own True Ghost Story details an event that reportedly happened to Kipling when he was staying at a bungalow in Shimla while traveling. Charleville Mansion is never mentioned by name, so I'm not sure how people know this is what he was talking about. I'm pretty sure there are other haunted houses in Shimla, but I could be wrong. According to Kipling's story, he spent the night in a bungalow in Shimla referred to as Katmal Dak Bungalow. I could not figure out what language this was in or what it meant. During the night, he heard what sounded like people playing billiards. He thought these people were doilies, which is a nickname for newcomers in the Air Force Academy. When he asked a servant about this the next morning, the servant told him there were no doilies staying in the bungalow that night. But, the servant continued, a man had died in the house once, back when it used to be a billiard room. Kipling could have sworn he heard people playing billiards, but never actually saw anything. I can't say for sure if the story is true, if it's really about Charleville Mansion, or if it was even meant to be believed. But the entire text is online, so I will leave a link below if you want to read it for yourself. One last thing I want to mention is a video I found of a group of people exploring what looks like it might be Charleville Mansion. The video isn't in English, I believe it's in Hindi, but even if you don't speak Hindi, you can see the supposed mansion and get a sense of what it looks like. And if this is the real Charleville Mansion, it's clearly abandoned and has been for a while. So that's about all I have for you today on Charleville Mansion. It's obviously shrouded in a lot of mystery and contradictory accounts, but I actually think that kind of makes it more interesting. Though I have to say, if it turns out that it's true that the current owners changed the name and wanted privacy, please don't bother them. If you have ever been here or to another haunted place in India, I would love to know about it in the comments. There are also tons of other haunted places in India I would love to look into, including a couple of abandoned towns. So if you would like more videos on haunted India, let me know. So I've always found ghost towns really interesting. There's just something so haunting about a town that was once thriving and is now basically frozen in time. In a way, I think they remind us of our own mortality. We too could be alive and thriving one day and gone the next. Wow, that was really dark. Anyway, today's video will delve into a town that's been called Alabama's creepiest ghost town. Let's talk about Cahawba. By the way, I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. I watched a few other videos to see how other people pronounced it, so this should be correct, but if it's not, I'm sure someone will let me know in the comments. The ruins of Old Cahawba, sometimes spelled cahawba, lie about 8 miles southwest of Selma in central Alabama. The word cahawba is thought to have Native American origins, but we're not really sure just what it means. Cahawba was Alabama's first capital after it officially became a state in 1819. Despite its status as a capital, it was pretty underdeveloped for the first few years, and it wasn't exactly an ideal place to live, let alone have your capital city. The city's low elevation made it prone to flooding, and it also had an unusually high mosquito population. In 1826, the capital was moved to Tuscaloosa, and a lot of people left Cahawba in the ensuing weeks. In 1846, the capital was moved to Montgomery, where it still is today. Over the next few years, Cahawba would have its ups and downs. In the 1850s, it was a major shipping port to Mobile on the Alabama coast. A railroad was built in 1859, and by the time the Civil War started in 1861, Cahawba's population had grown to almost 3,000. Not a major city by any means, but still thriving. But during the war, things started to change. The government ripped up the newly built railroad and used the iron for another unspecified railroad elsewhere. An old cotton warehouse was turned into a prison for Union soldiers. The prison originally held about 600 men, but that number soon grew to 3,000, the population of Cahawba itself. Several sources said conditions at the prison weren't very good. I could never find any details about this, but with so many people crowded into one place, it's not that hard to believe. About 147 men are thought to have died there. In 1865, the year the war ended, the town flooded again. In 1866, Cahawba lost its title as county seat of Dallas County, which was moved to Selma. After the war, the population took a sharp decline. A lot of former slaves moved there, but they eventually left too. By 1870, the population had gone from 3,000 to just 300. By 1930, most of the town's buildings had been destroyed, burned down, or fell apart on their own. The town was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1975 and officially unincorporated in 1989. Hey everyone, it's your favorite person, Editing Mary. So there's a lot of history that I left out here. I originally intended for this to be solely a paranormal video, so I wanted the paranormal aspect to be front and center, although as you'll see in a second, it was limited. So I didn't want to bog down the narrative with history in case people weren't interested in that. But if you'd like to know more about Cahawba's history, you should check out cahawba.com. I will leave a link to it in the description. Thanks, and back to the video. So for a town with this much rich, dark history, there really aren't that many ghost stories. In fact, before we get into the hauntings, I want to share a couple of stories associated with Cahawba that are pretty dark but don't have any hauntings attached to them. The first is the story of John A. Bell, who was killed in a shootout on Cahawba's main street on May 23, 1856. There were multiple people involved in this shootout, but as far as I could find, Bell and his father were the only people killed. According to the website Rural Southwest Alabama, the survivors of the shootout went on trial but were acquitted. Needless to say, the Bell family was not happy about this. John A. Bell's gravestone reads, "No murderer hath eternal life abiding in him." The second story is the Sultana disaster. Remember those 3,000 soldiers in the cotton warehouse turned prison? After the war, a bunch of these newly freed prisoners, along with some from Andersonville, Georgia, got on board the Sultana in Vicksburg, Mississippi. This 260-foot wooden steamboat was built to hold about 376 people, but ended up with over 2,000 on board. Nevertheless, it continued up the Mississippi, set to release the passengers in Cairo, Illinois. But in the early morning hours of April 27, 1865, about 8 miles outside Memphis, the boilers exploded, causing a huge fire. Of the about 2,300 people on board, 1,800 of them died, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in U.S. history, according to battlefields.org. So now that you know a little more about the town's dark history, let's talk about ghosts. Groundskeepers at the New Cahawba Cemetery have reported hearing disembodied voices while they worked. Because John A. Bell is buried here, I do wonder if some of that can be attributed to his ghost, but nobody seemed to know for sure. School groups have claimed to have recordings of unusual sounds, and others say they've captured unexplained lights or shadows in photographs. Another site that's reportedly haunted is the Barker House. This mansion was built in 1860 by Stephen Barker and contains slave quarters behind the house. After people started leaving the town in the 1870s, the house was bought by Samuel McGurty Kirkpatrick. It burned in 1935 and was later rebuilt, but today it's in pretty bad condition. The only people usually let inside are paranormal investigators. Reports from said investigators include a ball rolling across the floor on its own and a stuffed animal appearing to communicate with something else in the room, though I'm not sure of the details surrounding that. Another story centers on a man named Herbert, though the story presumably took place when he was a child. Herbert spent a summer vacation with his grandfather who lived in Cahawba. While there, Herbert met a man named Gat who would watch over him as he wandered about town. When he got home, Herbert told his brother about this man named Gat, and his brother informed him that Gat had died before Herbert was born. But the most well-known haunting in Cahawba seems to be Pegue's ghost. Colonel Christopher Claudius Pegues was the leader of the 5th Alabama Regiment and was mortally wounded leading a charge at the Battle of Seven Pines in Virginia in May 1862. He died from his wounds 2 months later on July 15th. As the story goes, a couple was walking behind Pegue's home in the spring of 1862. As they walked, they spotted a ball of light, sometimes referred to as a will-o'-the-wisp. They tried to touch it, but their hands went right through it. It later disappeared into a bush, but then came back and followed them. I'm not sure how long it followed them. Because this story reportedly happened a few months before Pegue's death, it probably wasn't his ghost, but it has been seen as a bad omen, maybe even a supernatural warning. Other sources have said the incident with the will-o'-the-wisp actually happened in 1863. so after Pegway's died. Interestingly, Pegway's isn't buried in Cahawba or even in Alabama, but at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. So I think it's safe to say his ghost probably isn't hanging around Cahawba anymore. Today, what's left of the town is known as Old Cahawba Archaeological Park. Archaeologists, historians, and tourists visit it year-round. In 2008, the Cahawba Foundation was established. Their mission is to secure private financial support from individuals, corporations, and foundations for the State Historic Park at Old Cahawba. So that's all I have for you today on Old Cahawba. Frankly, I'm even more skeptical of these ghost stories than I usually am. You would think there would be more specific stories of ghosts of people who died in the city's prime, but there just aren't that many. But of course, I would love to know your thoughts. Do you think Cahawba is haunted, and have you ever been there, or would you like to go someday? Let me know in the comments. I love to travel, but one of the places I've always wanted to visit but never gotten around to it is New York City. With such a big city that has a long storied history, it shouldn't be a surprise that some hauntings have creeped up over the years. Let's look at one of the city's well-known ghost hangouts, the House of Death. The place known as the House of Death is actually a 4-story, 10-unit apartment building that sits at 14 West 10th Street in the neighborhood of Greenwich Village. From everything I've seen, it seems like a pretty good place to live. The website forrent.com gives it a walk score of 99, a transit score of 100, and a bike score of 94. It's also less than a mile from NYU, Washington Square Park, and Fifth Avenue. Unsurprisingly, there are no available units right now. Some sources said the house was built in 1900, but most said it was built in the 1850s. In 1900, the house welcomed arguably its most famous resident, author Mark Twain. Twain only lived in the house for a year and didn't die until almost a decade later in an entirely different state, but apparently he likes to linger in his old New York residence even after death. The first reported occurrence of Twain's ghost happened in the 1930s, where he not only appeared to the house's residents, but even talked to them. One of the residents claimed the ghost identified himself as Clemens, presumably referring to Twain's real name, Samuel Clemens. Ever since, Twain has been spotted walking around on the first floor and near the staircase, wearing a white coat. According to untappedcities.com, the building was converted from a single-family home into an apartment building in 1937 because of growing demand for housing in the city. In 1957, former actress Jan Bryant Bartell and her husband moved into the top floor apartment, which used to be servants' quarters. It didn't take long for strange happenings to begin. Bartell claimed a monstrous shadow would follow her around the house. She would feel something brush against the back of her neck even when her hair was up, smell strange rotting smells, and hear footsteps following her upstairs, I assume when her husband wasn't around. The family dog would growl at a certain chair, furniture would move seemingly on its own, and other strange shadows were spotted. At one point, Bartell claimed to see a shriveled up grape show up on a dinner plate, even though there were no grapes in the house at the time. Bartell wanted to leave just a few weeks into living there, but the housing shortage prevented the couple from doing so. They ended up hiring a medium who told them the house was haunted by 22 spirits. The medium tried to help, but apparently became possessed by a spirit who refused to leave. Fortunately, the couple was able to find other housing shortly after this. In 1974, Bartell finished writing Spindrift, Spray from a Psychic Sea, which detailed the goings-on she experienced in the apartment. Just a few weeks later, she died under what the New York Post referred to as mysterious circumstances. Her book is pretty pricey today, even used, but I will put a link to it below if you still want to check it out. It's also worth noting that, according to untappedcities.com, Bartell also lived just down the road at 16 West 10th Street for a while, where she also reported experiencing paranormal activity. Either she had an affinity for attracting ghosts, or there was something else going on that had nothing to do with the paranormal. But the most horrific thing to happen in the building involved a man named Joel Steinberg. Steinberg lived in the building in the 1980s with his girlfriend Hedda Nussbaum and their 2 adopted children, 6-year-old Lisa and 18-month-old Mitchell. On the night of November 1st, 1987, Steinberg, in a cocaine-fueled rage, beat 6-year-old Lisa to the point of unconsciousness. Then he went out with his friends. Nussbaum found Lisa still unconscious on the bathroom floor around 6:30 the next morning and called the police. When she answered the door to let them in, she had a bruised face and a split lip. Police also found baby Mitchell tied to his playpen and covered in dirt and urine. Lisa was rushed to the hospital but died 3 days later. Steinberg was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and given the maximum sentence of 25 years. He was released on parole in 2004 after serving 16 years of his sentence. It was eventually discovered that the children had been illegally adopted. Steinberg had never formally filed adoption papers. After the investigation, Mitchell was returned to his biological mother. The case also increased the number of child abuse hotlines across the country. After Lisa's murder, residents claimed the hauntings slowed down quite a bit. On an entry on the blog Daytonian in Manhattan, someone in the comments section named Jason claimed he once went to a Halloween party in the Steinbergs' old apartment. The owners reportedly believed the place was haunted, saying the bathroom where Lisa was found would be unusually cold at times. The only other related report I found was a claim that the lights flicker on and off at strange times on the floor the Steinbergs lived on. But the hauntings never fully stopped and seemingly continue to this day. One other ghost who's been spotted is a woman in a long flowing gown. In one New York Post story, a musician/photographer resident named Dennis was interviewed. He claimed he was photographing a woman in his apartment one night, left the room for a second, and when he came back, the woman claimed she had seen this ghost. Dennis also claimed to have owned 10 different copies of Bartell's book, Spindrift. They kept disappearing, so he had to keep buying new ones. Either the House of Death ghosts really like to read or don't want people to know Bartell's story, or Dennis is even worse at losing things than I am. Other reports include a gray cat, a young child, and a faceless man. So are there really 22 ghosts haunting the place, as Bartell's medium claimed? It's never been confirmed that 22 people died in the building, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. In the previously mentioned blog entry on Daytonian in Manhattan, blogger Tom Miller writes, "A score of residents died over the course of 160 years, and any residents would be expected, especially considering that wealthy Victorians and Edwardians normally received medical treatment at home rather than a hospital." So that's all I have for you today on New York City's House of Death. If you've ever been there and have experienced anything unusual, or even if you haven't done either of these things, I would love to know what you think in the comments below. When you think of Oregon, what comes to mind? Portland? Mount Hood? That Oregon Trail game you played as a kid but could never beat because everyone in your wagon kept dying of dysentery? Like other states in the US, Oregon has its fair share of supernatural legends. Let's talk about 5 creepy haunted places in Oregon. Everyone loves Italian food, right? Well, I don't know about you guys, but nothing quite hits my taste buds like a good chicken parmesan. But visitors to Mangiare Italian restaurant in Independence might get a side of ghosts for free. The restaurant was opened back in 2012, but occupies a building that dates back over 100 years and started out life as a hotel. As the story goes, a 15-year-old girl named Eleanor fell in love with a man who soon went off to fight in World War I. When he was killed in combat, she took her own life by throwing herself into a skylight, her body landing in what is now the restaurant's dining area. Other sources say she killed herself after her boyfriend enlisted in combat. Legend has it that Eleanor's body left behind a bloodstain that nobody has ever been able to clean up. Visitors to the restaurant, as well as the surrounding area, have reported seeing her ghost. But is the story true? Probably not. There aren't any specific stories associated with Lenora or details of the hauntings, at least not that I could find. She's also said to have died in 1912, after her boyfriend enlisted in World War I, which didn't even begin until 1914. Still, no doubt her story has been entertaining Portland visitors and ghost enthusiasts for over a century. If you watch this channel a lot, you know college campuses are a hotbed for alleged paranormal activity, and Oregon State University, whose main campus is in Corvallis, is no exception. There are multiple different stories here, but most of them seem to concern two places: Waldo and Sackett Halls. Stories from Sackett Hall suggest it's haunted by a girl named Becky, who was killed by a frat boy. Becky has been blamed for occasional fires and supposedly stands over people's beds. If she's doing this while they're sleeping, this story just took on a whole nother level of creepy. The story of Becky seems to be nothing more than just that, a story. Sadly though, Sackett Hall did play a part in a very real, very documented tragedy in 1974. One night in May, 20-year-old Kathy Parks was abducted from campus. She was killed and her body was taken over 250 miles to Taylor Mountain. Her skeletal remains were found there the following year. Parks, as it turned out, had been one of the early victims of the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. At least one source I found said the hauntings of Sackett Hall could be contributed to Parks, but the stories were vague. But on to a much lighter story. Waldo Hall is said to still be home to Ida Kidder, the school's first librarian. Kidder lived in Waldo for many years when it was still a women's dormitory, until her death in 1920. She seems to be one of those ghosts who loved her home so much, she just never left. Students and staff have reported feeling an unseen presence when they were otherwise alone, doors slamming shut on their own, and furniture moving on its own. Others claim they see a woman disappear in front of them on a second-floor hallway or hear high heels on the floor. Personally, I find this last one a bit of a stretch. After all, it is a university, and I suspect a lot of women on staff wear high heels. Maybe even some men too. I'm not going to assume. Another bit of speculation suggests the activity at Waldo Hall might actually be due to a squatter, which would make everything here creepy in a much different way. Not to be confused with the famous New Orleans cemetery of a similar name, Lafayette Pioneer Cemetery is a cemetery in the town of, you guessed it, Lafayette. Or Lafayette, we pronounce it differently down here. But while the name is pretty straightforward, the paranormal legends are anything but. The cemetery is said to be haunted by two women, Anna Marple and Lena Imus. It's difficult to find accurate information on these women, at least not without doing some serious digging. Concerning Anna Marple, we do know that her son Richard was hanged in 1887 for the murder of a man named David Corker. Many people believe Anna was involved in the crime, but she was never charged. According to Find a Grave, Anna died in 1916 when she was in her early 70s. She wasn't buried in Lafayette Cemetery, but if you believe the legends, she still calls it her eternal home in a sense. Anna was said to be either a witch or a gypsy, depending on what source you read. As her son died, she cursed the town, saying it would burn 3 times. 2 fires in the city reportedly followed soon after, leaving residents waiting for that last one. Visitors to the cemetery have reported seeing an apparition laughing over the graves. If you go after dark, you might be chased away by a woman with talons, leaving claw marks on your back. Another story concerns a married couple who visited the cemetery in the early 2000s. They didn't experience anything unusual while they were there, but they did film their experience. When they reviewed the footage, they heard a woman's voice saying, "Run home." There's even less reliable information on Lena Imus, the other alleged ghost of Lafayette. People have reported seeing a woman among the headstones and hearing laughing or footsteps, reportedly all attributed to her. However, these things could also be attributed to living, breathing people. Lena is also said to haunt a nearby winery that used to be her home. Underneath the streets of downtown Portland lies a series of basements and tunnels. All sorts of stories abound concerning these tunnels, many of which allege they were once home to numerous illegal activities. According to the stories, the tunnels were used in the early 1900s for shanghaiing, kidnapping someone and forcing them to work, usually on a boat. Stories abound of sailors or men at boarding houses being drugged, kidnapped, and dragged to the tunnels, forced to work as slaves. As you can imagine, this was a violent process, and there were numerous deaths in the tunnels, not only of Shanghaied sailors, but other kidnapping victims and people who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There is a lot of debate about whether these Shanghaiing stories are actually true, but that didn't stop them from spreading and from earning these so-called Shanghai tunnels the reputation of being the most haunted place in the city. One ghost reportedly sighted in the tunnels is that of an Asian man dubbed Sam. Sam is said to turn off lights in the basement of nearby bars and move things around as people walk by. Another reported ghost is that of a woman named Nina. Nina was said to be a prostitute in life until she was sedated and killed by being thrown down an elevator shaft. Nina is blamed for tugging on people's clothes or hair and things being moved around in the upstairs bars. She's also said to appear to those bar employees and customers, wearing either all black or all white. Unsurprisingly, the ghosts of sailors are also said to haunt the tunnels. People report seeing apparitions and feeling themselves being touched by a cold, wet hand. Other ghost sightings in the tunnel are believed to be those of gangsters, partygoers, or people who were unfortunately caught in the crossfire of illegal activity. Multiple tours of the tunnels were offered in the past, but most of them don't seem to be operating anymore. The legitimacy of these Shanghaian stories, as well as those of the hauntings, will likely continue to be debated for years to come. Also known as the Stone House, this building sits in Portland's Forest Park and, interestingly, contains the city's most remote public restroom. Commissioned in 1929, it was initially meant to be a pit stop with a picnic shelter and the aforementioned bathroom. But years before the actual house was built, a family who lived on the property became involved in a very dramatic and tragic situation. In the 1850s, the Balch family lived on the property. The family consisted of patriarch Danford Balch, his wife Mary Jane, and 9 children between them. Some they had together, others were from previous marriages. After moving to the area, Danford Balch hired a man named Mortimer Stump to help work on the grounds. Exactly what Mortimer did there isn't clear, but he did quickly fall in love with the Balch's 15-year-old daughter, Anna. Danford Balch wasn't too happy about this, even threatening to kill Mortimer if he didn't leave his property. Mortimer did leave, but he took Anna with him, and the couple got married. In November of 1858, Balch ran into his daughter and new son-in-law at a saloon in Portland. A confrontation ensued. Balch returned home after this confrontation, but he wasn't done yet. He had another drink, something he reportedly did often in these days, grabbed his shotgun, found the couple again, and shot Mortimer twice in the face. When Balch was arrested for the murder, he claimed his wife was a witch who had put a spell on him to kill Mortimer. Once in court, he claimed the shooting was accidental. But neither of these defenses held up, and he was convicted of the murder. He was hanged in October of 1859 in what was reportedly the state's first public execution. After Balch's death, his land passed through several different hands before the so-called Witch's Castle was built. The building is abandoned today, though sometimes occupied by the occasional squatter or partying teenager. But is it also home to more otherworldly beings? The ghosts of just about every character in this tale are said to haunt the area. Danford Balch, his wife Mary Jane, Anna, and Mortimer Stump. Visitors have reported flickering orbs around the building, ghost children whispering nearby, and horrifying screams that presumably can't be traced back to any human. Interestingly, guests will also sense that there's a passage nearby that will take them home. A man dressed in 19th century clothing has also been spotted, walking around and hooting like an owl. I don't know why he does this. Sometimes the man will ask people if they've seen Anna. Sightings of the man go up during the month of October, the month that Danford Balch died. Is this Balch in the afterlife looking for his daughter? Maybe to beg her forgiveness? There is one more odd story of the place that's been attributed to the supernatural. Reports of toilets flushing on their own. However, if they're automatic flushing toilets, that's not too surprising. Those things practically have a mind of their own. So those are all the haunted places in Oregon I have for you today. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been to any of these places and experienced anything supernatural. Thanks for watching and have a creepy day. Bye guys.